Welcome to Dead Air Confessions. Late at night, when the streets are empty and the signal begins to fade, people start sharing the things they never say out loud. The strange call they received, the person they saw standing outside, the night they realized they were not alone. Tonight, you will hear stories from people who carried those memories for years. Before we go on air, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy true scary stories with a quiet, late-night feel, subscribe to Dead Air Confessions. Turn the volume down low. The line is open.
When I was a student living in Hirakata, Japan, a group of friends and I went out one night for someone's birthday. The bar was a few miles from our dorm. Most of my friends were drinking pretty heavily, and by the time everyone finally decided to leave, it was somewhere around 3 in the morning. Public transportation was basically done for the night. So most people chose the obvious option and took taxis back. I did not drink. I never really had much interest in it, and because I was completely sober, I decided I would just walk. It was not some reckless decision made because I did not know the area. I had made that walk hundreds of times. By then, the route was almost automatic. I knew where the hills were. I knew the bridge. I knew which intersections took longer. I knew which streets became completely empty late at night. And honestly, I liked walking through the city at that hour. During the day, there were people everywhere. Cars, bicycles, buses, students, people going to work. At 3 in the morning, everything changed. The city felt almost abandoned. Streetlights reflected off the pavement. Traffic became occasional instead of constant. You could hear things you normally never noticed. Sometimes I found it peaceful. That night was especially quiet. The air was cool and there was a light drizzle. Not enough rain to make me miserable. More like a mist. I put my headphones on and started walking. I remember the weather very clearly because the route had a couple of hills and one bridge with a fairly steep incline. Normally, by the time I reached the top, I would be warm from the walk, so the cool rain actually felt good. It kept me from overheating. There was nothing frightening about the first part of the walk. I was tired, but not drunk. I was not stumbling around. I knew exactly where I was. I had music playing and just followed the route I had taken so many times before. Eventually, the rain started getting heavier. By then, I was probably around 15 minutes from the dorm. At that point, I knew I was going to get soaked, no matter what I did. Running would not save me. So I just increased my pace a little. Not a sprint, just a faster walk. That section of the route passed a house on a corner that I had noticed before. It was old-looking and run down, not necessarily some horror movie abandoned mansion, just neglected. The kind of building where the paint looked worn, the exterior needed work, and you could not immediately tell whether someone still lived there. This was during the economic difficulties of the early 2010s, so I never thought much about it. Maybe somebody lived there and could not afford renovations. Maybe it belonged to an older person. Maybe it was abandoned. It was not my business. I had passed it countless times without anything happening. That night, I walked by it, like usual. Then I felt something. A chill went straight down my spine. I know that phrase gets used in every scary story, but I do not know how else to describe it. It was sudden, different from the rain, different from the cold air on my wet clothes. Something inside me basically said, turn around. I have always been cautious, maybe overly cautious sometimes. If I get the feeling that somebody is behind me, I check. If a situation feels strange, I would rather look stupid for being careful than ignore it. So I turned, and there was an old man directly behind me, not 10 feet away, not across the road, right there. Close enough that when I turned around, his face seemed to fill my vision. I nearly jumped backward. I had not heard him approaching. Not one footstep. No coughing. No clothing moving. Nothing. 1 second I believed I was alone on the sidewalk. The next, there was an elderly man standing inches away. I can still picture him. He looked like he was somewhere in his 60s or 70s. His skin was heavily weathered, almost like old leather. His hair was completely white and slicked back. He was wearing a sleeveless undershirt and loose pajama pants. He was barefoot. That detail bothered me. It was the middle of the night. It was raining. And this elderly man was standing outside barefoot in what looked like sleep clothes. But the strangest thing was not his clothing. It was the way he stood there. He did not react when I spun around. Most people, if they are walking behind someone and that person suddenly turns around aggressively, react. They stop. Step back. Raise their hands. Apologize, smile, look surprised. Something he did none of that. He was motionless, expressionless, just looking at me. I instinctively created distance. I think I almost leapt backward. My hands came up. I was ready to defend myself. Even remembering that feels a little ridiculous. There I was, a young student practically squaring up against a barefoot man old enough to be my grandfather. But in the moment, I did not feel ridiculous. I felt threatened. And I could not explain why. He was not holding a weapon. He did not raise his fists. He did not bare his teeth or shout. There was no obvious aggression in his face. If anything, there was almost nothing in his face. That was the problem. No emotion, no apology, no confusion, no acknowledgement that we were standing far too close to each other in the rain at 3 a.m. He just watched me. My instincts were screaming. I tried to say something to him in Japanese. At the time, my Japanese was not particularly good. I could get around. Order food. Handle basic conversation. But I was definitely not prepared to sound intimidating while confronting a stranger in the middle of the night. What came out was basically the equivalent of, "What are you doing? You have a problem?" Except probably grammatically terrible. Imagine trying to threaten someone while speaking like a toddler. That was me. He did not answer. Not even a word. He kept looking at me. I kept staring back. Neither of us moved. The rain was falling around us. I still had my headphones on, or partly on, though at that point I was not paying attention to the music. The entire situation felt disconnected from everything around it. I have no idea exactly how long we stood there. In my memory, it was around 30 seconds. It may have been shorter. 30 seconds is an incredibly long time to silently stare at someone when you are only a few feet apart. Even 10 seconds would feel endless. But it was long enough for me to move beyond surprise and into genuine fear. I was trying to figure out whether he was about to attack me. He did not. Eventually, without changing his expression, he turned around. Then he walked toward the run-down house. He went inside. No explanation, no goodbye, no visible anger. He just turned and entered that building. I stood there stunned. For a second, I did not know what to do. Then my brain finally made a decision. Leave, I turned and ran. Not walked. Ran, I covered the remaining distance back to the dorm as fast as I could. By the time I got there, I was soaked. I went to my room, and I pretty much sat there for the rest of the night. I could not settle down. I kept replaying it, how close he had been, how I had not heard him, the expressionless face, the bare feet, the silence. The fact that he had been standing behind me long enough for some part of me to sense something was wrong before I consciously knew he was there. The next day, I told my friends. They were interested, but I could tell some of them thought I was exaggerating. I have always been a bit of a storyteller. So I understand why. If you know someone likes telling stories, then when they come in saying, "An old man silently appeared behind me at 3 in the morning," you are probably going to assume some details got improved in the retelling. But I was not trying to make it better. I had genuinely been frightened. More frightened than I had been during situations that were objectively more dangerous. I had been in fights. I had been in accidents. I had experienced moments where I knew I could actually get hurt. None of those stayed with me the same way this did. That is what I find interesting now. The man never did anything to me. He did not chase me. He did not threaten me. He did not even speak. Yet the encounter felt deeply wrong. There are ordinary explanations for almost every part of it. The easiest one is why I never heard him. I had headphones on. That alone explains a lot. People underestimate how much environmental sound disappears when music is playing directly into your ears. Even if the volume was moderate, it could have masked footsteps. Then add rain, water hitting pavement, water hitting leaves, my own shoes on wet ground, wind, the sound of my clothing as I walked, the normal, distant traffic. An elderly barefoot man could actually be extremely quiet. Bare feet on wet pavement are much quieter than shoes. If he lived in that house, he may have stepped outside moments before I passed. Maybe he saw me. Maybe he walked toward me. I simply did not hear him because my hearing was occupied. There does not need to be anything impossible about his approach. The chill that made me turn around may also have a normal explanation. Maybe I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Maybe I saw his shadow. Maybe the lighting behind me changed. Maybe I heard a faint sound underneath the music without consciously recognizing it. The brain processes far more information than reaches conscious awareness. Sometimes you react before knowing why. A tiny sensory cue can produce, "Someone is behind me." Then you turn and discover that someone actually is. That can feel supernatural because the conscious thought arrives without an obvious source. But the source may simply be subconscious perception. I do not think I had a psychic warning. I think some part of my sensory system noticed him. His presence changed something. Light, sound, air movement. The rhythm of footsteps, maybe even smell. My brain flagged it before I identified it. That explanation actually makes the experience more realistic, not less. The old man himself may have been completely ordinary. Maybe he lived in the rundown house. In fact, that seems likely if he walked directly inside. Maybe he had stepped outside because he heard something. It was 3 in the morning. A stranger wearing headphones was passing his property in heavy rain. Perhaps he was the one wondering what I was doing. Maybe he had trouble sleeping. Maybe he had gone outside to check the weather. Maybe he smoked and had stepped out without shoes. Maybe he heard me approaching and wanted to see who it was. Maybe he had been standing near the edge of the property before I arrived, and I simply walked past him. Then he followed close enough that I eventually sensed him. None of that requires anything paranormal. His clothing fits someone who had been inside sleeping. Undershirt, pajama, pants, bare feet. If anything, those clothes support the idea that he lived there. He may not have planned to be outside for long. He could have stepped onto a covered entrance area, noticed me, and moved toward the sidewalk. His silence also has normal possibilities. I spoke to him in broken Japanese. Maybe he did not understand me. Maybe he was hard of hearing. Maybe he had cognitive impairment. Maybe he was confused. Maybe he simply did not want to engage with an unknown foreign student who had suddenly turned around with fists raised. From his perspective, I may have looked dangerous. Imagine being an older man standing near your house in the middle of the night. A younger stranger turns around, jumps away, raises his hands as if preparing to fight, and starts speaking broken Japanese aggressively. Maybe the safest response is to say nothing. He could have been evaluating me exactly as I was evaluating him. Neither of us knew what the other person wanted. I interpreted his stillness as threatening. He may have interpreted mine the same way. Then, he decided, not worth it. Went inside. If that is what happened, the story from his perspective would be completely different. He hears someone walking past his house late at night. Maybe he comes outside to check. A foreign student suddenly spins around and nearly attacks him. The student demands something in broken Japanese. The old man stares because he has no idea what is happening. Then he turns around, goes home, and probably tells someone the next day about the crazy person he encountered in the rain. That version makes me laugh now. But it is plausible. The expressionless face may also have become more sinister because of the context. Faces are difficult to read in poor lighting. Street lights create shadows. Rain changes skin reflections. An older person's resting expression can look severe. If I was already frightened, I would focus on anything that failed to reassure me. No smile. Threat, no apology. Threat, no stepping back. Threat, he did not need to show aggression. The absence of normal social signals was enough. Human beings rely on tiny behaviors to determine whether strangers are safe. Someone accidentally gets too close. They immediately move away and say sorry. That restores normality. This man did not. So the encounter remained unresolved. That is probably what my instincts were reacting to. It was not his age, not his clothes. It was the violation of expected behavior. Why are you this close? Why didn't you react when I turned? Why aren't you saying anything? Why are you staring? Those questions produce fear because there is no clear social explanation. The fact that it happened at 3 in the morning amplified everything. If the exact same man stood behind me in a supermarket at noon, I might find him rude or strange. At 3 in the morning, on an empty road, he becomes a possible threat. Context changes perception. The weather mattered too. Rain reduces visibility. It masks sound. Reflections make distances harder to judge. A wet street under artificial lighting can make everything look slightly unreal. I had been walking for a long time. I was physically tired. Even though I do not drink, fatigue can still reduce attention. I had been out late at a birthday. It was around 3. I had walked several miles, including hills. I was wet. My body was ready to be home. All of that could make an unexpected encounter hit harder. Being sober does not mean being at peak alertness. There is another possibility I have considered. Maybe the man had been walking behind me for much longer than I thought. That is scarier, but still ordinary, because of the headphones. He could have followed for a significant distance without me noticing. Perhaps he was simply heading home. We happened to be traveling the same direction. I passed his house. He was right behind me. I sensed him. Turned. He stopped. From my perspective, he appeared out of nowhere. From his perspective, I had been walking behind this guy for 2 blocks. Then he suddenly spun around. If he was going home to that particular house, his later behavior fits perfectly. He did not chase me. He did not follow me after entering. He simply continued to his destination. The only strange part is why he was so close. But pedestrians sometimes close distance without realizing it, especially if the person in front is walking slower. I had slowed because of the rain and fatigue. Maybe he walked faster. Maybe he approached from a side path. By the time I turned, he happened to be only a step away. That coincidence would be startling enough to create the whole story. The rundown house is another detail that probably influenced how I remember him. I already thought the building looked slightly unsettling, not haunted, just neglected. Then the strange man walked into it. Of course, my brain linked the two. Creepy old man, creepy old house, perfect match. If he had entered a bright, modern apartment with flowers out front, maybe the whole thing would feel less supernatural. Instead, he disappeared into exactly the kind of building that looked like it should contain a mysterious old man. That made the event feel almost staged. But people who live in neglected houses are still just people. Maybe he had owned it for 40 years. Maybe he could not afford repairs. Maybe he liked it exactly the way it was. The recession context makes financial neglect even less mysterious. There is no evidence the house was abandoned. His entering it actually suggests it was not. I sometimes wonder if my assumption that it was abandoned made his presence seem more impossible than it was. I thought, nobody lives there. Then someone walks inside. Maybe I was wrong about the first part. That simple correction resolves it. The biggest thing that has always bothered me is how close he got without me noticing. But once I factor in headphones, bare feet, rain, and my own movement, even that becomes understandable. I was voluntarily blocking one of my most important senses while walking alone at 3 in the morning. I knew the route so well that I had become comfortable. Familiarity can lower vigilance. I was not checking behind me every 30 seconds. Why would I? I had made the trip hundreds of times without problems. That night, one man happened to approach closely enough to remind me that familiar does not mean controlled. The experience probably changed the way I walked at night afterward. Even if I did not stop wearing headphones completely, I became more aware of how much they isolated me. Because the truth is that a normal human being sneaking up unintentionally is scary enough. It did not need to be a ghost, and I do not think it was. There was nothing physically impossible about him. He did not disappear. He did not pass through a wall. He did not move unnaturally. He walked into a building. He behaved strangely, but strange human behavior exists. The fact that I could not read him is what made him frightening. There is also a cultural and language element. I was living in Japan. My Japanese was limited. Normal social communication was more difficult. If the same thing happened in my home country, I could have asked clearly, "Were you following me? Do you live here? Are you okay?" He could have answered. In Hirokata, I was trying to communicate with the vocabulary I had. Maybe what I thought sounded like, "What are you doing? Do you have a problem?" actually sounded confusing or even nonsensical. He may have decided conversation was impossible. Silence was easier. The 30-second stare could also be distorted by memory. 30 seconds feels right because it felt long, but adrenaline changes time perception. A 5-second pause can feel enormous when you are preparing for violence. Imagine standing nose to nose with someone while waiting for a punch. Every second stretches. Maybe he looked at me for 6 or 7 seconds, then turned. Years later, a good 30 seconds. I cannot verify it. The emotional truth is that it lasted much longer than I wanted it to. That is enough. My hands being raised probably affected him too. I was ready to fight. I might say now that I was only defensive. He did not know that. A younger man taking a fighting stance can make an older person freeze. The expressionless stare could have been caution. He may have been deciding whether moving suddenly would provoke me. Then, when I did not attack, he slowly turned and left. That is a completely different A few years ago, when I was around 9 or 10, I stayed awake later than I ever had before at that age. I do not remember exactly why I was up so late. There was not really anything exciting happening. I was not sneaking around the house. I was not watching horror movies. I was not playing some intense game that kept me wired. I think I simply did not have much to do, and for whatever reason I kept myself awake far past the point where I normally would have been sleeping. At that age, 2 in the morning felt almost unreal. It was not a normal hour. It belonged to adults, nightmares, and houses that sounded different when everyone else was asleep. During the day, you never really notice how much noise a house makes. People are walking around. Television is on. Doors open and close. Water runs. Cars pass outside. Someone drops something. Someone moves a chair. All those sounds blend together. Late at night, especially when you are the only person awake, every little noise suddenly has room around it. And that night, I was already exhausted. I remember lying in bed trying to get myself to sleep. I had stayed awake long enough that I was no longer having fun. I was tired, but there is a strange point where being overtired can make it harder to settle down. Your body wants sleep. Your brain seems to refuse. You start paying attention to things you normally would not. The room feels too quiet. Your own breathing sounds loud. Every movement outside the bedroom becomes important. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I started hearing little noises from outside my room. Taps, small bangs. Nothing huge at first, just enough to make me listen. I tried to ignore them. Old houses make sounds, even newer houses do. A pipe shifts. A wall pops. A refrigerator turns on. Something outside taps against the window. At 9 or 10, though, I was not calmly running through those explanations. I was lying alone in the dark, listening. Tap, silence, another little bang. Then, nothing again. My heartbeat started getting louder. At least, it felt louder. Once you become afraid at night, you start hearing your own body as part of the environment. Your pulse pounds in your ears. Your breathing feels too obvious. You suddenly become aware of every tiny sound the mattress makes when you move. I kept telling myself to sleep. That was probably the worst possible thing to do, because trying hard to fall asleep usually makes you more aware that you are still awake. I closed my eyes, waited, another noise. My heart sped up again. I was tired enough that I knew sleep had to come eventually, so I tried to stay in bed. Then, only a few seconds later, I heard something completely different, an explosion. That is the only word I can use for how it sounded to me. Not an object falling, not a cabinet slamming, not a normal crash. It sounded enormous. In my memory, it was something close to the sound of lightning striking directly outside the house. Maybe slightly less violent than that, but not by much. And it seemed to come from the garage. The sound was so sudden and so loud that whatever fear I had about the little taps disappeared instantly. This was not, what is making that noise? This was, something just happened. I got out of bed immediately. There was no lying there trying to convince myself it was nothing. If something had exploded in the garage, I needed an adult. I went to my dad and his fiancée, who was with him at the time. I told them there had been a huge noise in the garage. I expected them to already know. That is how loud it had seemed. I thought they would say, yeah, we heard it. Maybe they would already be getting up. Maybe they would think something fell. Maybe a shelf collapsed. Maybe something electrical had blown. Instead, they looked confused. They had not heard anything. That did not make sense to me. The sound had seemed far too loud for someone else in the house to miss. I insisted. It came from the garage. Something had happened. So they got up and checked with me. We walked out. As we approached, The motion sensor lights turned on, and the garage looked completely normal. Nothing on the floor. No shelf collapsed. No broken object. Nothing had fallen. No obvious damage. No smoke. No smell. No sign that anything remotely explosive had happened. Everything was where it should have been. That confused me even more. I remember looking around, expecting there to be some explanation hiding in plain sight. A box, knocked over. A tool fallen from a shelf. Something, but there was nothing out of place. My dad and his fiancée repeated that they had not heard the sound, not even something smaller. From their point of view, I had apparently woken them up in the middle of the night because I had heard an enormous explosion that had left no evidence and that neither of them had noticed. At that point, there was not much else to do. We went back inside. Everything stayed quiet. Nothing else happened. And somehow, after all that, I went back to sleep without any major problem. That part is almost funny to me now. At the time, the sound was terrifying. But once adults had checked the garage and found nothing, I think my brain accepted that I was safe. No intruder, no fire, no broken equipment, no disaster. So eventually, I slept. Years later, though, I still remembered it. I am 16 now, and when I think about that night, what stands out is still the volume. If I had heard a tiny pop, and nobody else did, I would not care. People hear little things all the time. But I remember this as huge, something that should have shaken everyone awake. That is why it seems so mysterious. The most obvious explanation now is probably that being extremely tired had something to do with it. Sleep deprivation can do strange things to perception. You do not need to be awake for days. Especially as a child, staying up far beyond your normal bedtime can put you into a strange border state between full wakefulness and sleep. Your brain can begin producing dreamlike sensory experiences even while you believe you are awake. Sounds are especially common around the transition into sleep. People can hear their name. A knock. A door slam. A voice. Music. Someone shouting. Sometimes people hear a sudden explosive sound. There is even a sleep-related phenomenon often called exploding head syndrome, where someone experiences an extremely loud imagined bang, crash, or explosion while falling asleep or waking. The name makes it sound dangerous, but the experience itself is generally described as a sensory event rather than a literal explosion. I cannot say that is definitely what happened to me. I was 9 or 10. I was not diagnosed with anything. I have no way to reconstruct exactly how close to sleep I was. But the description is interesting. A person is exhausted. They are lying in bed. They hear an impossibly loud crash. Nobody else hears it. There is no physical source. That is very close to my experience. The fact that the sound seemed to come from the garage does not rule that out. The brain is very good at assigning location to a sound even when the sound is internally generated. Dream sounds come from somewhere too. You dream that a door slams downstairs. You hear someone speaking from the hallway. The mind creates not just the sound, but a direction and distance. So if my tired brain produced a sudden auditory event, it could easily have placed it in the garage because that was a meaningful location in the house. Maybe the earlier taps and bangs were part of the same process. I may have been drifting in and out of very shallow sleep without realizing it. A real house creak enters my perception. Then another. Then my brain begins generating more. My anxiety rises. I get closer to sleep. Suddenly, boom, I wake fully. From my perspective, I never fell asleep. But very brief sleep transitions are not always remembered. People can swear they were awake continuously, even when they had short microsleeps or partial arousals. That would explain why the sound felt so real. Dream sounds do feel real while they are happening. That is why alarms sometimes get incorporated into dreams. A real alarm can become a fire alarm in a dream. Someone calling your name can become a character speaking. The boundary between outside sound and internally generated sound is not always clean. Another possibility is that there really was a physical noise, but it was much smaller than I remember. Maybe something in the house popped, a heating duct flexed, a pipe knocked, a large appliance changed cycle. The garage door shifted in its frame. Metal contracts as temperature changes. Wood settles. A refrigerator or freezer compressor can make surprisingly violent noises. A water heater can knock. A vehicle can produce a cooling metal pop after being parked. Something outside could have banged. If I was already anxious and sleep deprived, my brain may have amplified it. The event then becomes stored as explosion. Meanwhile, my dad and his fiancée, asleep in another room, either did not wake or heard the same small noise and ignored it. That would solve the contradiction. It was not that they slept through a lightning strike level explosion. The original sound may never have been that loud physically. It was that loud to me. This distinction matters. Perceived loudness is not the same as measured loudness. Fear changes perception. So does surprise. If you are already listening for danger, a sudden bang feels far more violent than the exact same bang during the day. Imagine a book falling off a shelf at noon. You turn around. At 2 in the morning, alone, already frightened, the same book sounds like someone kicking in a door. Context adds intensity, and childhood memory can add even more later. I was 9 or 10. I did not have a decibel meter. When I say it was as loud as lightning outside the house, I am describing how the memory feels now. Maybe at the time I only thought that was insanely loud. Years later, I needed a comparison. Lightning was the closest one. That does not mean the physical sound was actually equal to thunder. Memory preserves emotional scale better than acoustic measurements. Another possibility is that the noise came from outside. A car backfired. Something large dropped nearby. A dumpster lid slammed. Fireworks. A transformer. Construction equipment. An object hit metal. Sound at night can travel surprisingly far, especially when everything else is quiet. It can also be difficult to locate accurately. A bang from several houses away can seem like it came from your garage. Walls reflect sound. Garages contain large, flat surfaces. The structure itself can transmit vibrations. I might have heard something outside, and my brain placed it inside. Why did my dad and his fiancée not hear it? Maybe their bedroom was on the opposite side of the house. Maybe they were sleeping deeply. Maybe their door was closed. Maybe a fan was running. Maybe the direction of the sound made it much more noticeable from my room. People assume that if a sound is loud, everyone nearby must hear it equally. That is not always true. Building acoustics can create surprisingly different experiences from room to room. One person hears the neighbor's television clearly. Someone 10 feet away hears almost nothing. A vibration enters one wall, travels through a beam, and seems to explode from a particular corner. So the fact that they heard nothing does not absolutely prove the sound was internal. But the garage showing no disturbance makes an actual major explosion almost impossible. Something that loud physically should have left something. Damage, movement, a fallen object. At least another witness outside. The total lack of evidence strongly suggests either a smaller ordinary sound or a sleep-related perception. The motion sensor lights are a detail I still remember because they made the inspection feel dramatic. We walked out. Dark garage. Then the lights clicked on. For a second, I expected to see chaos. Instead, everything was ordinary. That contrast probably strengthened the memory. My mind had prepared for wreckage. The garage presented nothing. There is also the possibility that the little taps and bangs before the explosion were real and unrelated. Maybe I was hearing thermal contraction around the house. As temperatures drop overnight, materials shift. Roofing, siding, wood framing, ductwork, metal doors. A series of small pops can happen. Then, one larger piece of metal flexes and makes a sharp boom. Anyone who has heard a metal roof or large duct suddenly pop knows it can be startlingly loud. Garages often contain exactly the kind of materials that produce those sounds. Large metal door, tracks, springs, vehicle panels. Tools, shelving, temperature changes can make one part suddenly release tension. Then when you inspect, nothing looks different, because nothing broke. That explanation fits the taps followed by one big bang. It even explains why I thought the garage was the source. Maybe it genuinely was. The problem remains that nobody else heard it. But sleeping adults can miss things. People sleep through thunderstorms, alarms, barking dogs, and passing trains. A child awake and already alert will notice a sound that sleeping adults may not process. So I cannot completely dismiss a real garage noise. The garage door itself could be a candidate. A large door can flex or settle. Springs and tracks hold tension. A panel can make a sudden bang without actually opening or failing. I do not know what kind of garage we had, so I cannot say that happened. But it is an ordinary possibility. Another thing worth considering is the sequence of my fear. The small taps came first. My heartbeat increased. I tried harder to sleep. Then the giant sound happened. That progression is almost perfectly designed to make the final bang feel supernatural. But it may also show how my nervous system was primed. By the time the loud sound occurred, I was already expecting something. A person who is calm experiences a bang as a bang. A frightened child experiences it as confirmation. Something is here. Something is happening. My body may have produced such a strong startle response that the subjective sound became fused with the physical sensation. When you are startled, muscles jerk. Your chest tightens. Your ears can ring. Your heartbeat slams. For a split second, several sensations happen at once. The memory becomes one massive event. That could explain why I remember it as almost explosive. The fact that I calmed down afterward also points away from anything ongoing. Once the adults checked the garage, the uncertainty was resolved enough for me. My fear did not continue producing noises all night. Nothing followed me. Nothing appeared. No repeated explosions. No strange damage discovered the next morning. The experience ended exactly when I felt safe again. That is consistent with a tired, anxious brain settling down after reassurance. If there had been an external physical problem in the garage, it might have happened again, or eventually shown itself. Apparently, it did not. I also think my age matters in another way. At 9 or 10, staying awake until 2 in the morning may have been a much bigger physiological disruption than it would be now at 16. A teenager can become used to late nights. A younger child often has a much stronger sleep rhythm. Pushing far beyond it could place the brain in an unusual state. I remember saying this was probably the longest I had ever stayed awake at that age. That is an important clue. The strange experience happened on the same night I was unusually sleep-deprived. That does not prove causation, but it gives a very strong ordinary explanation. If I had heard the same explosion every Tuesday at exactly 2 in the morning, that would be different. If multiple people heard it, different. If the garage door shook, different. Instead, it happened once under conditions where my perception was especially likely to be unreliable. That is why I do not think there was anything paranormal in the garage. There was no entity, no evidence of an intruder, nothing invisible exploding. The mystery is probably neurological, acoustic, or both. And honestly, that is still fascinating. The brain can produce something so convincing that you run to wake adults because you are certain part of the house just exploded. Then everyone walks into the room where the sound supposedly came from and finds perfect silence. That disconnect is eerie. It shows how much confidence we place in our senses. Hearing feels objective. A sound happens. Therefore, something made it. Most of the time, that assumption works perfectly. But near sleep, the brain can generate sound with no external source at all. And when it does not politely label it, "This is internally generated." It simply sounds real. That might be what happened to me. I sometimes wonder whether my dad and his fiancée thought I had dreamed it. Probably, from their perspective, that would be the obvious answer. A tired child comes in at 2 in the morning, insisting there was an explosion. They heard nothing. Garage is normal. Child eventually goes back to bed. Dream, case closed. But I understand why younger me resisted that explanation. I remembered being awake. I remembered the little taps. I remembered trying to fall asleep. I remembered the huge bang. It seemed like a continuous sequence. No dream transition, no waking up. But sleep does not always announce itself. You can drift for seconds, have a sensory event, snap awake, then build a memory that feels continuous. That is one reason these nighttime experiences are so convincing. There may never have been a moment where I thought, I fell asleep. So I concluded I had not. It is also possible the sound happened during the exact moment my brain was transitioning into sleep, before full dreaming even began. That would preserve the feeling of being fully awake. 1 second, I am lying there listening. Next second, explosion. Eyes open, heart racing. I assume it came from the garage. That fits extremely well. I do not think I will ever know which explanation is correct. A real structural bang, a distant external sound, a sleep-related auditory event, maybe a combination. The house produces a small pop. My half-asleep brain transforms it into something enormous. That is probably the best overall explanation because it accounts for both the sense of an external source and the extreme perceived volume. What I am sure about is the experience itself. At 9 or 10 years old, lying awake much later than I should have been, I heard little noises outside my room. I became frightened. Then I heard what seemed like an enormous explosion from the garage. I got out of bed immediately. I woke my dad and his fiancée. They checked with me. Nothing. They had heard nothing. The garage showed no sign that anything had happened. And afterward, the house was completely normal. That is all the evidence I have. No ghost story attached. No history of someone dying in the garage. No object that appeared afterward. No mysterious mark. Just one impossible-sounding bang. Sometimes the lack of a dramatic explanation is exactly what makes an experience stay with you. If we had found a fallen ladder, I would have forgotten the night years ago. If Dad had said, "Oh, the garage door does that when it gets cold," maybe the memory would barely exist. Instead, we opened the door expecting an answer and found nothing. That left the sound without a cause. And a sound without a cause is surprising. When I was around 5 years old, my family spent part of the summer at my grandparents' cabin. It was in a very rural area, surrounded by a huge amount of forest. There were trees everywhere, not just a few around the property, but the kind of place where the woods seemed to start almost immediately beyond the cabin and continue forever. During the day, it was beautiful. Bright sunlight coming through the branches. Birds, insects, the smell of trees and dirt. At night, it could feel completely different. But what happened to me did not happen at night. That is one of the reasons I still remember it. It was bright outside. Sunny, there were no dark corners for my imagination to fill. My family was outside near the cabin, maybe 40 feet away, getting a fire ready. I was inside by myself for a little while. I do not remember why. Maybe I was playing with something. Maybe I had gone inside to get a drink. At 5 years old, I was not thinking about being alone. My family was right outside. I could probably hear them. There was nothing frightening about the situation. Then I looked toward the door. Something moved directly in front of it. At first, my brain registered Daddy Longlegs. That was the closest thing I knew. Long, thin legs. Small central body. The same basic proportions. Except this thing was enormous. Not enormous in the way a child might call a normal spider enormous because they are scared of it. I mean that from where I was standing, it looked like it was around 2 feet tall. Its legs seemed ridiculously long, and the central body looked about the size of a tennis ball. It walked across the area in front of the cabin door. I remember seeing the legs move. That is the part that stayed with me. It did not look like a strange plant blowing in the wind. It looked alive. It looked like some gigantic version of an insect or spider I already recognized. A Daddy Longlegs, just scaled up to an impossible size. I stood there watching it. I do not remember screaming. I do not remember immediately calling my parents or grandparents. I think I was more confused than frightened. At 5, your understanding of what is possible is still flexible. If I saw the same thing today, my immediate reaction would be, that cannot exist. At 5, maybe part of me thought, I did not know they could get that big. Children are still learning the size limits of animals. You know a dog can be small or huge. You know some bugs are larger than others. If you have never been taught that Daddy Longlegs do not grow 2 feet tall, maybe seeing one does not initially break reality in the same way. I only saw it for a short time. Then, it was gone. It crossed past the doorway and disappeared from view. I do not remember going outside to find it. I do not remember anyone else seeing it. My family was only around 40 feet away, which makes that part of the story strange. If a 2-foot-tall spider-like animal really walked past the cabin in broad daylight, you would expect somebody else to notice. Something that large moving around a clearing would be difficult to miss. But nobody reacted. No one shouted. No one came running. As far as I know, nobody else saw anything unusual. That is one of the biggest reasons I assume my perception was wrong. I was 5. The sighting was brief, and there was no physical evidence afterward. Still, the memory was vivid. It was vivid enough that years later I could still picture those long legs moving past the door. I could still remember the central body, the size, the sunlight. That is what made me wonder whether I had actually seen something strange rather than simply dreamed it. But vivid childhood memories can be misleading. A memory feeling clear does not mean every measurement inside it is accurate, especially size. Children experience scale differently. When you are 5 years old, almost everything is large. Doors are larger relative to your body. Furniture is higher. Adults are giants. A normal animal that would look small to an adult can seem much more impressive to a child. That does not turn a several-inch Daddy Longlegs into a 2-foot creature, obviously, but it means my later size estimate may not reflect what I actually saw. I did not have a tape measure. I did not stand beside it. I did not photograph it next to the door. 2 feet tall is an adult interpretation of a childhood visual memory. At 5, I may simply have thought, huge. Years later, my brain translated huge into a specific measurement. Maybe it had been 6 inches across, maybe 10, maybe smaller. A child looking down at a spider close to the floor can easily experience it as enormous. There is another major possibility. The object may have been much closer to my eyes than I thought. If you look through a doorway or window and a small insect passes very close to your face, it can appear gigantic against the distant background. This is one of the easiest ways to misjudge size. A small object nearby and a large object farther away can occupy the same amount of your visual field. Without good depth cues, the brain has to choose. Imagine a normal daddy-long-legs crawling on a strand of web or plant stem only a few inches from your face. Behind it is the cabin door or the outdoor clearing. If your eyes focus more on the background than the insect, the animal might appear as a huge silhouette moving through the space outside. Its legs could seem feet long. Its tiny body could look much larger. At 5 years old, I would have had no reason to think, that bug is 3 inches from my eye. I would simply think, there is a giant spider outside. That explanation is especially good if I was looking through glass. I do not remember whether the door had a window or whether I was viewing it through an open doorway. If there was a pane of glass, a normal daddy-long-legs crawling on the glass itself could look enormous because the background was much farther away. A child could easily interpret it as an animal outside in the clearing. Even adults sometimes make this mistake with insects on windshields. A tiny spider on the glass can briefly look like a massive creature on the road because your brain assigns it the wrong distance. Then you refocus and realize it is inches away. If that happened to me, I may never have reached the second step. I saw it. It moved past. Memory saved, giant daddy-long-legs. Another possibility is overlapping objects. The forest was full of thin branches, grass, sticks, plant stems. A normal spider moving among them could create a much larger composite shape. Maybe the spider itself was ordinary, but several branches lined up with its legs. My brain grouped everything together. Now, one small creature has 6-foot proportions. Or perhaps there was no spider at all. Several thin twigs blowing together could briefly look like long, moving legs. The central tennis ball body could have been a pine cone, leaf cluster, seed pod, or shadow. Humans are extremely good at building familiar objects from incomplete shapes. If I already knew daddy-long-legs, that pattern was available. Long, thin things radiating from a central point. Spider. Once the brain selects that interpretation, movement in separate branches can look coordinated. That is called pareidolia in a broad sense. We see faces in clouds, people in shadows, animals in rocks. Children do it constantly because their imagination is active and their visual system is still learning what patterns mean. Again, that does not mean I saw nothing. There may have been a real moving arrangement of branches and insects. The interpretation may simply have been wrong. The bright sunlight actually supports some visual explanations. Strong sunlight creates sharp contrast. Thin objects can appear almost black against the bright background. If something passed through the doorway with the outside behind it, I may have seen mostly silhouette. That removes detail. A silhouette with long extensions becomes a spider-like form very easily. Sunlight can also create moving shadows from branches outside. Suppose leaves or thin branches cast a shadow across the floor or wall near the door. A breeze moves them. Several long shadow lines seem to walk. A circular patch in the center appears to be a body. At 5, the shadow could become an animal. But I remember it as three-dimensional and outside, so a simple shadow does not perfectly match. Still, memory can convert a shadow into an object over time. There are also real animals with long legs that could have been misidentified. A large harvestman, which is what people often call daddy longlegs, would still be nowhere near 2 feet tall. But there are insects and arachnids with surprisingly long appendages. Crane flies can look enormous when close. Certain spiders can have large leg spans depending on region. A large insect viewed against a doorway can look much stranger than expected. There could also have been a small bird, lizard, or other creature tangled with grass that my child brain simplified into a spider shape. If it moved quickly, I may only have captured the overall geometry. The central body being tennis ball sized also makes me think distance may have been wrong. A normal spider body would be tiny. A larger object behind it could have looked attached. Maybe the spider was on a branch with a knot. The knot became the body. The real spider's legs plus branches became giant legs. I saw one impossible creature where several ordinary things overlapped. That kind of error can happen in less than a second. The family being only 40 feet away is important. If the creature was truly 2 feet tall and moving across open ground, there are several questions. Where did it go? Why did nobody else notice? Why was there no sound? Why did nobody find enormous tracks, webs, or anything similar? Why did I never see another one? An animal that large would not be a subtle biological discovery. A spider-like creature 2 feet tall living around a family cabin would leave evidence. Someone else would eventually encounter it. There would likely be local stories, photographs, specimens, or at least repeated sightings. None of that exists in my memory. So I do not think I saw a literal, giant daddy longlegs. The experience was probably caused by scale, distance, or memory. The fact that I was only 5 gives those explanations a huge advantage. At that age, the difference between what I saw and what I understood could be significant. There is also the possibility that the memory itself came partly from a dream. I do not strongly think that, because I remember the bright cabin scene as if I were awake. But childhood memories can merge dreams and real events. Maybe I did see a normal daddy longlegs near the cabin one afternoon. Then that night, I dreamed it was enormous. Years later, the two memories combined. Now I remember the giant one happening during the day. That is possible. Children often have vivid dreams about ordinary events from earlier in the day. A bug becomes huge. A dog talks. A familiar room changes. When you wake, the dream may initially feel real. If nobody discusses it later, there is no external correction. Decades later, only the vivid image remains. I cannot rule that out. Another possibility is that an adult said something that shaped the memory afterward. Maybe I told someone I saw a huge daddy longlegs. They laughed and asked, "What, like 2 feet tall?" Maybe that number became part of the memory. Or perhaps I compared it to a tennis ball later, not at the time. The more often a childhood story gets retold, the more specific it can become. That does not necessarily mean exaggeration. Memory likes structure. Something big becomes 2 feet tall. Big body becomes tennis ball. Those comparisons help explain the story to people, but eventually they can feel like original observations. Because I do not remember anyone else witnessing it, there is no second memory to compare mine against. That leaves me alone with a 5-year-old's visual experience. And 5-year-olds are not reliable measuring devices. Still, I understand why the memory stayed. It is one of those images that does not fit with everything else around it. Bright afternoon. family nearby, safe place. Then one impossible animal walks across the doorway. There is no creepy buildup, no midnight, no forest noises, no feeling of being watched. Just, what is that? That simplicity can make a memory stronger. There was no fear afterward to distort it dramatically. I just saw something strange. The fact that it was daytime also removes some explanations people immediately use for unusual sightings. No darkness, no half-asleep state, no shadowy bedroom. But daylight does not make perception perfect. In fact, bright backlighting can produce very strong silhouettes, and children can make distance errors in full sunlight just as easily. If the insect was close to me, bright daylight may actually have made its outline clearer while still hiding the fact that it was nearby. I have tried imagining the scene from an adult perspective. I am inside a cabin. My family is 40 feet away near a fire pit. I see what looks like a massive daddy longlegs walking in front of the door. What would I do? Probably step closer. Look again. Take a photo. Call everyone. Open the door. Follow it. Those actions would give me more information. At 5, I did not investigate. I saw it and accepted the image. That is why the mystery remained. The event ended before adult-style verification began. No second angle. No close inspection. No scale reference. No witness. That is exactly the kind of situation where visual mistakes survive forever. If I had walked 3 steps toward the doorway, maybe the 2-foot monster would suddenly become a normal harvestman crawling on the screen. If I had called my dad, maybe he would point at a cluster of branches and laugh. If I went outside, maybe nothing would be there. But I did none of that. At least, not that I remember. So the original interpretation was never corrected. It also probably helped that the forest environment made strange animals feel plausible. Cabins in rural woods expose children to creatures they do not normally see. Huge beetles, moths, spiders, snakes, frogs, things under logs. Every summer there is some insect that looks like an alien if you have never seen it before. At 5, I did not know the full catalog of what lived in the forest. Maybe I assumed giant daddy longlegs were simply another woodland thing adults had not told me about yet. That could explain why I was not hysterical. I was amazed, maybe disturbed, but not necessarily convinced something supernatural had appeared. It was just an animal, a very wrong-sized animal. That response actually makes sense for a child. Children often accept impossible things briefly because their model of the world is still incomplete. If you tell a 5-year-old there is a fish longer than a car, that is true. A snake longer than a room, true. A bird taller than a person, true. So why not a spider 2 feet high? They have not yet learned which biological sizes are impossible. The creature may only have become impossible years later when I understood what a daddy longlegs actually is. That changes the emotional meaning of the memory. Maybe at the time I simply thought, wow, that one is huge. Then, as an adult, wait, that cannot have happened. That retroactive impossibility makes the story feel mysterious. I also wonder about the exact species I thought I saw. People use daddy longlegs for different animals depending on where they live. Sometimes harvestmen, sometimes cellar spiders, sometimes crane flies. A crane fly is especially interesting because it has very long legs and can move awkwardly. If one was flying or walking close to the doorway, its motion could look much larger than it was. A crane fly on a screen door can be startlingly big relative to what children expect. If it was inches from my face, the apparent scale against the outdoors could be enormous. The center body of a crane fly is not tennis ball sized, obviously, but again, glare or overlapping objects could enlarge it. A harvestman on glass is probably the cleaner explanation. Tiny body, long legs, exactly the silhouette I remember. Wrong distance equals wrong size. That may genuinely be the entire story. Something else worth considering is motion parallax. Objects close to you appear to move across the background much faster than distant objects when you move your head. A small spider close to my face could seem to stride rapidly across the outdoor scene. Its legs might appear to cover huge distances. If I shifted position while looking, the spider's location relative to the distant cabin doorway would change dramatically. My brain could interpret that as the creature itself crossing the ground. Again, real bug, wrong depth, giant monster. No hallucination required. That explanation preserves why the experience was so vivid. I really did see a daddy longlegs like animal. It really did move. I was not seeing things in the sense of inventing an image from nowhere. I simply misjudged where it was. That is probably the explanation I like best. It respects the memory while correcting the impossible scale. And because I was 5, there is no reason I would have noticed the depth error. My visual system had the image. My brain made its best estimate. The estimate was wrong. There is also no reason for me to turn it into cryptozoology or something paranormal. People sometimes hear stories about oversized insects and immediately imagine undiscovered species or mutated creatures. But a 2-foot-tall harvestman would create enormous biological questions. Its body structure would need to support much greater mass. Its respiratory... When I was 9 months pregnant, something happened at my front door that I still think about because of the way my cat reacted. At that point in my pregnancy, I was obviously very aware of being physically vulnerable. I could still move around and take care of myself, but I was heavily pregnant. If something went wrong, I knew I would not be able to move as quickly as I normally could. I would not be able to run easily. I would not want to get into any kind of physical confrontation. Most of the time, though, I did not sit around thinking about danger. I was at home. It was my own place. I had my cat with me. Everything felt normal. Then, somebody started banging on the front door. Not a gentle knock. Not the polite little knock somebody gives when they are unsure whether anyone is home. It was loud enough to immediately get my attention. My first reaction was automatic. Someone is at the door. Go answer it. I started moving toward it. That was when my cat did something I had never heard her do before. She made a noise that sounded like barking. I know that sounds ridiculous. She was obviously still a cat. But the sound that came out of her did not resemble her normal meow. It was short, harsh, and strange enough that my attention shifted from the door to her. What made it even weirder was her behavior. Normally, when somebody came to the house unexpectedly, she would run. That was her pattern. Door noise. Stranger, gone, she would disappear under my bed or find somewhere else to hide. She did not like unfamiliar people coming into the house. So when the banging started, I expected her to do exactly what she always did. Instead, she stayed beside me. She did not run. She did not hide. She remained close and made that strange bark-like sound. That stopped me. I cannot really explain it better than that. I had been preparing to answer the door, and then my cat reacted so differently from normal that something in me changed. I started feeling cautious. Maybe she had heard something I had not. Maybe it was just the force of the knocking. Maybe she could smell whoever was outside. Maybe she was picking up on my own tension. I did not know. But suddenly opening the door did not feel like the obvious thing to do anymore. So instead of unlocking it, I looked through the peephole. There was a woman standing outside. The only comparison I can really make is Professor Trelawney from Harry Potter. She had that kind of eccentric appearance, wild-looking hair, a face that stood out immediately. Something about her looked intense. Maybe it was just her expression. She looked angry or mean. Behind her, I could see what looked like a white vehicle, possibly a van. I did not know who she was. I was not expecting anyone. She was not somebody I recognized. And she had just been banging hard on the door. I stood there looking through the peephole. She could not see me clearly through it, at least as far as I knew. My cat was still with me. I did not answer. Eventually, that was it. Nothing happened. No attempt to force the door, no screaming, no dramatic confrontation. I simply did not open it. The woman left. For years, what stayed with me was the cat. If I had been home alone without an animal, I probably would have looked through the peephole anyway. Maybe I would have opened the door slightly. Maybe I would have asked what the woman wanted. I do not know. But the cat's reaction interrupted that automatic sequence. Normally, she was the one who ran from unfamiliar people. This time, she stayed right next to me. And that strange sound seemed almost like a warning. It is easy to tell the story afterward and make it sound as though the cat sensed something evil. Animals supposedly know when someone is dangerous. The cat protected the pregnant woman. She sensed a threat before I did. That version is compelling. But I do not think I need to assume anything supernatural about my cat. Cats have extremely sensitive hearing. Their sense of smell is far better than ours. They notice vibrations. They notice people moving outside. They can react to unfamiliar sounds, voices, footsteps, scents, and body language before a human understands what is unusual. If somebody was aggressively banging on the door, that alone could have produced a different response from my cat. Maybe normal visitors knocked softly enough that she interpreted them as strangers entering the territory and ran to hide. This woman was hitting the door hard enough to trigger a defensive response instead. Flight is not the only thing animals do when frightened. Sometimes they freeze. Sometimes they vocalize. Sometimes they stay close to a familiar person. Sometimes they act in ways their owners have never seen before. The bark-like noise may have been one of those unusual cat vocalizations. Cats can make strange sounds. Chirps, growls, yowls, chattering noises. Short cough-like or bark-like calls. If an animal is highly aroused or alarmed, the sound can be very different from its everyday meow. The fact that I had never heard it before made it feel significant. But maybe I had simply never exposed her to that exact combination of stimuli before. A stranger pounding on the door. Me standing nearby. Possibly voices or movement outside. A vehicle close to the property. All of those details could have changed her normal response. She may also have been reacting to me. I was 9 months pregnant, but more importantly, I had just been startled. Even before consciously deciding something was wrong, my body may have changed. Muscle tension, breathing, movement, voice, heart rate. Animals that live closely with people become very good at noticing behavioral changes. Maybe the cat saw me freeze and stayed close because I was behaving unusually. In my memory, her reaction came first. That may be true, but these things can happen almost simultaneously. Knock. I tense. Cat reacts. I notice cat. Then later it feels like the cat warned me before I knew anything. The difference is only a second or two, but memory naturally turns it into a cleaner sequence. There may also have been something about the person outside that caught the cat's attention. A strong perfume, another animal's scent. Smoke, something carried on clothing. the smell of a dog from the vehicle. We never know how much environmental information an animal is receiving. To me, there was just a woman outside. To the cat, there may have been 20 unfamiliar signals. That does not mean the woman was dangerous. It only means she was unusual enough to produce an unusual reaction. The woman herself may have had a completely ordinary reason for knocking. She may have had the wrong address. Maybe she was looking for someone. Maybe there was a problem with a nearby property. Maybe she was collecting something. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she was trying to sell something. Maybe she was angry at somebody she believed lived there. Without opening the door, I never found out. The white vehicle behind her made the situation feel more suspicious to me. But again, a person arriving at a house usually comes by vehicle. There is nothing inherently threatening about that. Still, when you combine an unknown person, forceful knocking, an angry-looking expression, and being alone while heavily pregnant, caution makes sense. I did not owe a stranger physical access to me just because she knocked. That is important. Sometimes when people tell stories like this, they become focused on whether the stranger was definitely a criminal. I cannot say that. Nothing happened that proved she intended harm. She did not threaten me. She did not show a weapon. She did not try to break in. She eventually left. So calling her a kidnapper, robber, or anything else would go far beyond what I actually observed. All I knew was I did not recognize her. I was not expecting her. She was knocking aggressively. Her expression made me uncomfortable. My cat was behaving strangely. I was 9 months pregnant. That was enough information to decide not to open the door. You do not need proof that someone is dangerous before choosing not to put yourself in a vulnerable position. There is a difference between saying, that woman was definitely going to hurt me, and I did not have enough information to feel safe opening the door. The second is all I can honestly say. In fact, the most unsettling possibility is not anything paranormal. It is that she could have been a real person with bad intentions. Human beings do sometimes knock on doors to see who is home. Sometimes people use innocent-looking individuals to get someone to open up. Sometimes a person is simply unstable or angry. Sometimes it is completely harmless. From behind a locked door, you cannot immediately know which one it is. That uncertainty is enough. I think being pregnant probably made my instincts stronger in the sense that I was thinking not only about myself. I was carrying a baby. Any confrontation had higher stakes. But I do not think pregnancy gave me supernatural intuition. I was just in a situation where being conservative about risk was sensible. The cat helped break the habit of automatically answering. That may genuinely have been useful, not because she detected evil, because she forced me to pay attention. She did something unexpected. I stopped. I checked. That is all. If she had immediately run under the bed like usual, maybe I still would have used the peephole. But maybe I would not have thought twice. Sometimes a small interruption is enough to change a decision. The bark-like sound became that interruption. Looking through the peephole was the best part of the response. It gave me information without exposing myself. I could see the woman. I could see that I did not know her. I could see enough of the scene behind her to know I was not expecting whatever was happening. And I could choose not to engage. There was no reason to open the door simply to satisfy curiosity. If she had an emergency, she could call for help. If she knew me, she could identify herself. If she had the wrong address, she would eventually realize nobody was answering. If she had bad intentions, the locked door remained between us. All outcomes favored staying inside. The fact that she left without further incident also matters. Maybe she really did have the wrong house. Maybe she was annoyed because she thought someone was deliberately refusing to answer. Maybe the mean face I saw was simply how she looked while waiting in bad weather or dealing with some frustration unrelated to me. Faces viewed through peepholes can also look strange. The lens distorts proportions. Features near the center can appear larger. People can look more severe or unusual than they do normally. That may explain some of the Professor Trelawney comparison. A peephole is basically a wide-angle lens. It is designed to show you a large area outside the door. That distortion can exaggerate eyes, nose, hair, and facial shape depending on where the person stands. Someone already eccentric-looking could appear much stranger through it. Lighting matters too. Hallways, porches, and entryways often have poor directional lighting. Shadows under the eyes, hair backlit, face partly dark. Combine that with a distorted lens and an already nervous viewer, and a perfectly normal person can look threatening. None of that means I was wrong to feel uncomfortable. Appearance is not evidence of danger, but the aggressive knocking and unknown identity were enough. What I find interesting is how much the cat's behavior influenced my interpretation. Imagine the same event without the cat. Loud knocking. I look through peephole. Odd-looking woman. I do not answer. Maybe I remember it for a week. Add the cat. My cat sensed something. My cat never does this. My cat stayed to protect me. Now the event becomes memorable for years. The animal gives the story a second witness of sorts. But animals cannot tell us what they were responding to. That is where people often make too much of their behavior. A dog barks at an empty corner. Ghost, a cat, refuses to enter a room. Ghost, a horse, suddenly panics. Something supernatural nearby. But animals respond to smells, sounds, insects, vibrations, and visual cues we miss constantly. Their unusual reaction tells us there was an unusual stimulus for them. It does not identify the stimulus. My cat may have smelled another cat on the woman. That alone could produce a defensive response. Maybe the white vehicle behind her had a dog inside. Maybe the woman carried food. Maybe her shoes had some animal scent. Maybe the knocking itself was enough. I will never know. I also cannot be completely certain the vocalization was literally unprecedented. I remember thinking, she has never made that sound before. That is probably true. But when something scary happens, unique details become sharper. Maybe she had made a similar growl once when frightened. Maybe I had forgotten. This time I was paying attention because the context mattered. Memory assigns significance based on emotion. The more frightened I became, the more unusual every detail felt. Her staying beside me was probably more meaningful than the sound itself. Cats are often described as independent, but they form attachments to people. Some will approach their owners when uncertain. Some use a trusted person as a secure point when assessing a threat. Perhaps my cat did not run because I was there. Maybe her strategy changed from hide alone to stay with the familiar human. I like that explanation. Not because she became my supernatural guardian. Because she was an animal choosing proximity to someone she trusted when confronted by an unfamiliar situation. Maybe she was scared too. In that sense, we were doing the same thing. Neither of us knew what was outside. We stayed together. The woman eventually left. That is much more believable than the idea that my cat psychically detected an evil person. It also preserves what made the experience meaningful. Her behavior still mattered. It still changed what I did. It just does not need magic. There is also the possibility that my own maternal state made me interpret the cat's proximity differently. At 9 months pregnant, protecting and being protected were emotionally powerful ideas. Maybe any unusual behavior from the cat would have felt significant. She stayed beside me. I felt like she was warning me. That memory became tied to the fact that I was about to have a baby. Again, that does not mean I invented it. It means context shapes meaning. I often wonder what would have happened if I had answered. Probably nothing dramatic. Maybe the woman would have said, "Sorry, wrong house." Maybe she was looking for the previous tenant. Maybe she needed directions. Maybe she would have asked some completely normal question and left. If that happened, I probably would not remember the day. The mystery survives because I never opened the door. That is how many unsettling encounters work. Choosing safety means sacrificing the answer. You do not find out who the stranger was, because finding out would require exposing yourself to the stranger. I am perfectly comfortable with that trade. I would rather have an unanswered story than a dangerous answer. Sometimes people think curiosity should win because they want the story solved. In real life, it does not need to, especially when you are alone and vulnerable. I do not regret leaving the door closed. I also think my cat may have taught me something useful that day, even without understanding what she was doing. Routine can be dangerous because we stop evaluating individual situations. Someone knocks. Answer. Phone rings. Pick up. Doorbell, open the cat, disrupted the routine. Something was different. So I checked first. That is a practical lesson. Pay attention when a familiar situation suddenly feels different. Not because intuition is paranormal. Because sometimes your brain or the people and animals around you notice details before you consciously identify them. A stranger's tone. An unusual knock. A vehicle that has been sitting outside. An animal behaving differently. None of those proves danger. Together, they justify taking a second look. The experience was also a reminder that a locked door is useful only if you keep it between yourself and an unknown situation. Opening it because you feel socially obligated defeats the purpose. I do not know who that woman was. I do not know why she was there. I do not know whether she had good intentions, bad intentions, or simply the wrong address. All I know is that she was not someone I expected. And once I saw her through the peephole, I felt no reason to take the risk. I stayed quiet. She went away. That is the least dramatic ending possible, and probably the best one. There was no supernatural event afterward. My cat did not continue growling at the door for days. The woman did not return every night. Nothing followed me through the house. No strange dreams, no unexplained marks, no curse. Just one person knocking and one cat acting unlike herself. That is exactly why I think a real-world explanation is enough. Maybe the cat heard the heavy footsteps outside before I did. Maybe the woman's scent made her uncomfortable. Maybe my cat simply reacted to the violence of the knocking. Maybe she picked up on my own surprise. Maybe the bark-like noise was just a frightened vocalization I had never heard before. Then I looked outside and happened to see a woman whose appearance made me even more uneasy. Those facts fit together without anything paranormal, but the emotional memory is still strong. I was 9 months pregnant. Someone was hitting the door hard enough to pull me out of whatever I was doing. I got up expecting to answer. When I was a teenager, I was depressed in a way that was much deeper than simply being sad. I do not mean the kind of temporary misery people sometimes joke about when they are young. It was not because somebody at school insulted me. It was not because of one bad grade, one breakup, or one stupid argument. A lot of things had been building for a long time. My parents had gone through a divorce that I had never really processed. I carried more of that than I admitted. At the same time, my education had become the most important thing in my life. School came before everything. Grades, expectations, performance, doing what I was supposed to do. I kept pushing myself because I thought that was what mattered. I did not pay attention to what was happening in my head. I did not think much about mental health. I did not think about whether I was actually coping. I just kept going. For a while, that worked. Or at least it looked like it worked from the outside. I went to school, did what I needed to do, spoke to people, functioned, but internally I was getting worse. Slowly at first. Then, much faster. I started feeling like everything had become too heavy. The divorce, school, pressure, other things I do not even want to go into. It all accumulated. Eventually, I stopped feeling as though there was anything ahead of me worth reaching. One day, I reached a point where I felt completely finished. Not dramatic, not crying uncontrollably, not angry, just finished. That is the part people sometimes misunderstand. They imagine that someone at their lowest point must look obviously miserable. They picture tears, panic, someone desperately asking for help. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes the opposite happens. That day, once I had made up my mind, I felt calm. I had spent so long fighting with myself that making a final decision felt, in the moment, like the fighting had stopped. I prepared what I intended to use later and left it somewhere in my room. Then I went to school. And the worst part was that I seemed happy. People noticed. Teachers, friends, other students. I remember people looking at me and seeing the change. They saw me smiling. They saw that I seemed relaxed. My eyes probably looked calmer. I was not carrying myself the same way I had been carrying myself during the worst parts of my depression. And people were relieved. They thought I was getting better. They thought, finally, she seems happy. Maybe things are improving. Maybe she is okay. I was not okay. The calmness was not recovery. It was resignation. I had stopped worrying about school, stopped worrying about the future, stopped worrying about whether people liked me. In my mind, none of it mattered anymore. That was why I could smile. There was nothing left to solve. That realization still unsettles me when I remember it. People around me were happy because they thought they were seeing me return to life. What they were actually seeing was someone who believed she had already decided to leave it. I went through the school day like that, calm, almost peaceful. I cannot remember every conversation. I do remember the general feeling, the strange lightness. Normally, my thoughts were constantly moving. Assignments, family, failures, what I should have done, what might happen next. That day, the noise had gone quiet. There was only the decision. Eventually, school ended. I got on my bike and rode home. I remember putting the bike in the shed. That detail has always stayed with me because of how ordinary it was. I had already made this enormous decision about my life. Yet I still put my bike away. Habit continued. Normal routine continued. The world looked like any other afternoon. Nobody watching me ride home would have known what I intended to do. I went inside, went to my room, I wrote a note. I will not describe every detail of what followed. I had saved medication over time, and I also had alcohol. I took enough to put my life in serious danger. Then I lay down. I expected that to be the end. What I remember next is not panic. It was the opposite. Everything became quiet. There was a sense of stillness, cold silence, no school, no arguments, no pressure, no thoughts running in circles, just nothing. Then, in my memory, I was somewhere else. I was standing in front of a dark gate. That is the image I have always used because that is what it looked or felt like. A boundary. Something closed. Something I was not supposed to go through yet. I could not tell you what the gate was made of. I cannot describe architecture. There were no detailed landscapes around it. The memory is more like an impression than a normal visual scene. Darkness, a gate, and the feeling that I was standing at some kind of edge. Then there was someone there, or at least a presence. I remember a voice. I cannot tell you exactly where it came from. I do not remember seeing a clear person speaking. It was simply there. The message was that it was not my time. There was something about unfinished business, things I still had to do, something I was leaving behind that had not been completed. I do not remember a long conversation. There was no detailed explanation of the universe, no list of reasons, no vision of heaven, no dead relatives walking toward me. Just that idea, not your time. You are not finished. Then everything changed violently. A sharp chemical smell filled my nose. It burned. My chest hurt. It felt as though something had slammed into me. In my memory, I experienced that sensation as hooks striking my chest. Then suddenly, I was back. The hooks were medical equipment. People were trying to revive me. The dark gate was gone. The silence was gone. I gasped. My body reacted violently as consciousness returned. I remember being sick. I remember the sounds around me. One detail that stayed with me was the clinking sound of pills or fragments hitting a medical bowl or container nearby. That small sound made everything horribly real. Before that, there had been this strange, quiet place. Then, suddenly, I was in a room with medical staff, equipment, harsh smells, physical pain, and noise. I was alive, not peacefully drifting somewhere. Alive in the most uncomfortable and undeniable way possible. I do not remember everything the medical team did. There are gaps. That is not surprising. My body had been under extreme stress, and I had taken substances that affected consciousness and memory. Some parts are clear, others are almost completely absent. The gate is one of the clear parts. The voice is another. The message is the clearest. You are not done. After I survived the immediate crisis, I was hospitalized for psychiatric care. I spent around 2 weeks there. At the time, being institutionalized felt overwhelming in its own way. Suddenly, my private depression was not private anymore. There were professionals, questions, schedules, people watching me, conversations about what had happened, conversations about what would happen next. I had gone from hiding everything to having no ability to pretend nothing was wrong. That was probably necessary. But it was not easy. I had to deal with the fact that I had survived something I had fully intended not to survive. That creates a strange emotional position. When someone rescues you from an accident, relief seems obvious. You wanted to live. Something threatened you. You survived. But when the danger came from your own decision, waking up can be much more complicated. Part of you may be relieved. Part may be ashamed. Angry, confused, embarrassed, grateful, numb. Sometimes all of those things exist together. I had to start understanding what had brought me there. The divorce I had never really processed. The pressure I put on myself. The way I had treated education as more important than my own ability to function. The things I had pushed aside because there was always another assignment, another expectation, another reason not to stop. Surviving did not magically fix any of that. The experience at the gate did not instantly cure depression. I did not wake up and become a completely different person. Real recovery was more complicated. It took work. But something had changed. The idea that I was not done stayed with me. After about 2 weeks, I was allowed to go home. I remember coming through the door. And the first thing that really caught my attention was my cat. There he was, just my cat. Nothing supernatural about him. He had not been part of the hospital. He did not understand any of what had happened. He did not know about the dark gate. He did not know that people had fought to keep me alive. He was simply there, waiting in the home I had tried to leave behind. I looked at him, and immediately that same message returned to me. Your business is not done. The wording was almost ridiculous in its simplicity, but it hit me extremely hard. I had spent so much time thinking only about my own pain that I had stopped seeing how connected I was to other living things. My cat needed me, or at least that was how it felt. He was part of my life. I was part of his. There were relationships that did not simply disappear because I had decided I was done. There were consequences I had not truly imagined. People, animals, things unfinished. A future I could not see while I was depressed. Looking at my cat, the whole idea from the experience became suddenly concrete. Maybe the unfinished business was not some grand destiny. Maybe I was not supposed to become famous, save the world, fulfill some supernatural mission. Maybe unfinished business could be as ordinary as being there for another living creature. Maybe it meant being there for people who loved me. Maybe it meant becoming someone I had not yet had the chance to become. At that point, I did not know. I only knew that looking at him made the message feel real. That experience became something I carried privately for a while. I understood how it sounded. People who nearly die sometimes report strange things. Tunnels, lights, voices, dead relatives. Religious figures, darkness, a feeling of being told to return. Some people interpret those experiences spiritually. Others interpret them as things the brain can produce while under extreme physical stress. Low oxygen, medication, changes in brain activity, fragments of memory, dreamlike states, sensory information from the room being incorporated into an internal experience. I cannot prove which explanation applies to mine. The hooks are a good example. In the experience, they felt symbolic, something grabbing me, pulling me back. Then I woke and understood that people were using medical equipment on my chest. That suggests at least some of what I perceived may have come from real physical sensations reaching a brain that was not fully conscious. The medical treatment happened. My brain tried to interpret it. Instead of understanding, doctors are doing this to my body, I experienced. Hooks are pulling me away from the gate. That is completely possible. The sharp smell could have been another real sensation from the room. Chemicals, medication, vomit, cleaning products, whatever was around me. My brain may have incorporated those sensations before I was fully awake. Dreams do that too. A phone ringing beside your bed becomes an alarm bell inside the dream. Someone shakes your shoulder, and in the dream, another person grabs you. The real world enters the imagined one without announcing itself. A near death or heavily altered state could do something similar on a much more intense level. The dark gate may have come from somewhere in my own mind. A symbol of death, a boundary, something I had seen in a film, book, religious image, or dream and forgotten. Maybe my brain created exactly the image it needed for the situation. You intended to die. Here is the threshold. Then the voice, not your time. Maybe that voice came from somewhere external. Maybe a medical worker was speaking while trying to revive me. Maybe someone said, "Come on, stay with us." Not yet, something like that. My brain could have transformed those words. Or maybe the voice came entirely from me, a part of my mind that still wanted to live, a part I had buried beneath depression. When everything else went quiet, maybe that part finally became audible. I cannot know, and I do not think I need to know with absolute certainty for the experience to matter. Something can have psychological meaning even if it was generated by the brain. That does not make it fake. Fear in a nightmare is real, even if the monster is not. Love in a dream can feel real even when the person is absent. A near-death experience can change someone regardless of whether its source is neurological, spiritual, or some combination we do not understand. For me, the important part was what happened afterward. I came back. I saw my cat. I remembered the message. I continued living. Later, I talked about the experience in a support group. That was difficult. There is always a risk when describing something like this that people will look at you differently. Some will think you are exaggerating. Some will immediately tell you it was definitely heaven. Others will tell you it was definitely just your brain malfunctioning. Both kinds of certainty can feel frustrating when you are the one who actually experienced it. I did not need someone else to tell me exactly what it was. I was trying to describe what happened. Then one guy in the group responded differently. He believed me. Not just in the polite sense of saying, "That sounds intense." He had experienced something extremely similar. The dark boundary. The sense of being told it was not time. The feeling of being sent back because something remained unfinished. The overlap was close enough that it shocked me. That was probably the first time I thought, what if this was not only my brain creating something random? If two people have similar experiences without deliberately copying each other, the similarity feels significant. I understand why. It is deeply unsettling when someone describes something from your own private experience, especially something you thought would sound impossible. But even that does not prove one supernatural explanation. Human brains are similar. Human fears are similar. Ideas about death often involve thresholds. Doors, gates, tunnels, journeys. Being called somewhere. Being turned away. Different cultures have been using those images for centuries. A person in a life-threatening state may construct similar symbols because we share similar ways of thinking about boundaries and endings. Medical treatment can create similar sensations too. Pressure on the chest, people shouting, being touched, pulled, moved, strong smells, sudden pain. If two patients go through resuscitation, some pieces of their experiences may naturally overlap. That is one possibility. The other possibility is the one that still gives me chills. Maybe we both came close to the same kind of boundary. Maybe there really was something there. I cannot prove that. Neither could he. All we had were our memories. But hearing him describe something so similar made it harder for me to treat my own experience as meaningless noise. Even if it came entirely from my brain, why did my brain choose that message? Why unfinished business? Why not nothing? Why not a random dream? Why not a memory from childhood? Maybe because some part of me did not actually want to die. That is probably the most grounded answer. Depression had convinced me there was no future. But the brain is not one single voice. The conscious part of me had decided I was finished. Another part may have been fighting that decision. The voice at the gate could have been that surviving part given a form. Not your time. You still have things here. Then, medical staff physically brought me back, reinforcing the message in the most direct way possible. Maybe the entire experience was my mind translating survival into a story I could understand. If so, I am grateful it did. Because unfinished business became a phrase I could carry. It gave shape to something depression had removed from my thinking. A future. Not necessarily a good future. Not necessarily an easy one. Just the possibility of more. Depression had turned life into a closed equation. Pain now. Pain tomorrow. Pain later. Therefore, stop. The gate experience introduced another variable. You do not actually know what comes next. That was enough. The image of my cat reinforced it. I had not finished loving things. I had not finished being loved. I had not finished finding out whether life could become different from what it had been. That does not mean a pet alone can cure severe depression. It cannot. It does not mean someone in crisis should simply think positively. That kind of advice completely misunderstands how serious suicidal depression can become. I needed actual help. Medical care. Psychiatric care. People around me. Time, I needed more than one mysterious experience. But the experience gave me something to hold on to while the real work happened. I think that is the healthiest way I can describe it. I do not use it as proof that suicide leads to a dark gate where someone sends you back. I cannot say that. Other people have entirely different near-death experiences. Some remember light. Some remember nothing. Some have frightening experiences. Some have peaceful ones. The variation itself should make us cautious about declaring one universal interpretation. And I definitely would not want someone in a suicidal state to hear my story and think surviving such an attempt is guaranteed. It is not. I survived because people found me, and medical professionals intervened. The physical reality was dangerous. The strange experience does not change that. There was nothing romantic about what happened. There was no beautiful sleep followed by a magical revelation. There was a medical emergency. There were people trying to keep me alive. There was hospitalization. There were consequences. There were people who had to discover what I had done. There was a life afterward that still required work. The gate is one part of that story, not the entire story. I have wondered many times how I was found. Who noticed? How long I had been unconscious? Exactly what the medical staff saw when I arrived. Some of those details are not as clear in my memory as the internal experience. That is strange when you think about it. The objective events are blurry. The impossible-looking ones are vivid. But that may be exactly what memory does during extreme states. It stores emotional images rather than timelines. I remember the gate because it meant something. I remember the voice because it addressed me. I remember the hooks because they hurt. I remember the smell because it burned. I remember the clinking sound because it told me exactly what had happened. Then I remember the cat because he made the message personal. Those are emotional anchors. Everything between them is less organized. For a while, I worried that people would think I had invented the near-death part after surviving. Maybe unconsciously. Maybe because I needed to create meaning. That is possible, too. Memory can be reconstructed afterward. A person wakes from a medical crisis with fragments. Later, those fragments become a coherent scene. Darkness becomes a gate. A voice becomes a sentence. A feeling becomes unfinished business. Over years of remembering, the story becomes cleaner. I cannot rule that out. But I also cannot erase how immediate the experience felt. I remember waking with the sense that I had been somewhere else. Whether somewhere else was a physical place is a different question. The experience itself happened inside my awareness. That much is true. And its effect on me was real. When the man at the support group described his similar experience, I felt that old sensation again. The cold, the stillness, the boundary, the message. I remember thinking, there is no way. How can you know that? Of course, he did not know my exact experience. He had his own. That was precisely what made it powerful. Maybe humans create the same kind of imagery when facing death. That would be fascinating enough. Maybe consciousness does something we do not fully understand. Also possible. Maybe there is a spiritual explanation. I cannot prove or disprove that from one story. I no longer feel the need to force a conclusion. When I was younger, I wanted to know, was it real? Now I think that question has two answers. Was the dark gate physically somewhere outside my brain? I do not know. Was the experience real to me, and did it influence the life I lived afterward? Absolutely. Those are different questions. I survived into a life that the depressed teenager in that bedroom could not imagine. That alone changes the meaning of the phrase unfinished business. At the time, it sounded like there was one specific task waiting for me. Now I think the unfinished business may simply have been life itself. All of it. The ordinary things. The difficult things. The people I had not met. The conversations I had not had. The mistakes I had not made yet. The things I would eventually understand about my parents. The ways I would learn to take my own mental health more seriously. Maybe nothing was written in advance. Maybe the message meant only, you cannot see the rest from where you are standing. That would have been enough. Depression makes the future look finished before it has actually happened. That is one of its cruelest tricks. It convinced me that because I could not imagine things changing, they never would. I confused lack of imagination with certainty. The person lying down in that room believed she knew everything important about the future. She did not. She could not. I know that now because I became the future she could not picture. That does not make every day easy. It does not erase what happened. It does not turn the attempt into something I am grateful happened. I wish I had received help before reaching that point. I wish someone had recognized that my sudden calmness did not necessarily mean I was recovering. I wish I had known how dangerous that sense of final peace could be. But I cannot change the order of events. I can only understand them differently now. The part that still disturbs me most is remembering how relieved everyone seemed at school. My smile fooled them because, in a way, it fooled the normal rules of emotion. They had been watching someone struggle. Then suddenly, I looked calm. Of course they thought that was good. How could they know? That memory taught me something important about how little you can sometimes tell from appearances. A person can laugh, smile, finish homework, go to class, ride a bicycle home, put it neatly in the shed, and still be in severe danger. The external routine can continue even when the internal decision is catastrophic. I had looked calmer because I had stopped fighting. That is something I wish more people understood. Not because every suddenly cheerful, depressed person is about to attempt suicide. That would be an unfair assumption. But because changes in mood need context. Sometimes relief means recovery. Sometimes it means someone believes they have found a way to end the problem permanently. You cannot know without asking and listening. I did eventually learn to talk. Not immediately, not perfectly, but surviving forced open conversations I had avoided. The support group was part of that. Hearing other people describe their own lowest moments made mine feel less isolated. And hearing that one man describe something similar to the dark gate made the world feel stranger, but also less lonely. For the first time, someone understood that part without me having to convince him. He did not laugh, did not tell me I had imagined it, did not immediately preach a religious explanation either. He just knew what it felt like. Sometimes shared understanding matters more than having the correct theory. I still think about my cat. Out of everything in the story, that may sound like the smallest detail. It was not. After hospitals, doctors, fear, questions, and 2 weeks away, I came home and saw something ordinary that had continued existing without me. A small, living creature that belonged to my everyday life. And suddenly, the voice from the gate had an answer. Unfinished business. There, right in front of me. Maybe that sounds sentimental. I do not care. That is genuinely how it felt. I had been so consumed by pain that I had reduced my existence to the pain itself. The cat reminded me that life is relationships, too. Responsibilities, habits, morning routines, food bowls, someone waiting by a door. The kind of things that seem too small to matter until you almost remove yourself from them permanently. I still do not claim I met death. I do not claim someone supernatural literally told me to go back. I do not know what happened during the period when I was unconscious. A brain under medical stress can do extraordinary things. It can create complete worlds. It can merge external sensations into symbolic images. It can distort time. It can produce voices. That explanation is powerful. So is the fact that some people report remarkably similar experiences. Both things can be true. Similarity does not automatically prove an afterlife. Neurological explanation does not automatically erase meaning. I am comfortable with uncertainty now. The teenager I was would have hated that. She wanted certainty about everything. Grades, family, future, her own worth. Maybe part of growing up was learning that you can live without having every answer. Including this one. Was the dark gate real? I do not know. Was the voice some surviving part of my own mind? Maybe. Did I hear fragments of what medical staff were saying and build a dream around them? Possible. Did I experience something beyond what we currently understand? I cannot rule that out either. What I know is that I went into that day believing my life was finished. Then I woke up with the words "not your time" burned more deeply into my memory than almost anything else from that period. I came home, saw my cat, and heard the message again in my own mind. Your business is not done. Years later, another person described something close enough to make my skin go cold. That did not prove anything. It did not need to. I am still here. That is the evidence that matters most to me. The girl who rode home that afternoon thought she knew exactly how her story ended. She was wrong. And whatever that dark gate was, dream, memory, dying brain, symbol, or something I still do not have a name for, I never got through it. Something brought me back before I could. For a long time, I thought the mystery was what waited on the other side. Now I think the more important mystery was everything still waiting for me on this one. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I learned very early that sometimes the most terrifying person in your life is not a stranger. It can be someone you are supposed to trust, someone who has a key to your house, someone whose voice you know, someone you call your father. At the time, my mother was preparing to leave him. I was too young to understand every detail of their relationship, but even as a child, I knew things were bad. There had been arguments, drug use, police trouble, a lot of instability. My father already had a long criminal record, and from what I understood later, he was heavily involved with drugs. At that age, though, I did not understand addiction or criminal behavior. I only understood moods. I knew when adults were angry. I knew when my mother was frightened. I knew when I should stay quiet. And I knew my father could change in ways that made the entire atmosphere of the house feel dangerous. Eventually, my mother told him she did not want him around anymore. She did not want him around me. She did not want him around our small family. She wanted him gone. He did not take that well. One day, during an argument, he hit my mother so hard that she lost consciousness. I do not like going into graphic detail about that memory. What mattered to me as a child was that 1 second my mother was there, and the next she was down. I did not understand whether she was going to wake up. I did not know what I was supposed to do. My father took her wallet and left. Then he disappeared. For about 2 weeks, we did not see him. Those 2 weeks started to feel like maybe it was finally over. My mother and I were still dealing with what had happened, but at least he was gone. There's a strange kind of relief that comes when someone dangerous disappears from your immediate world. You may still be afraid. You may still check doors. You may still wonder whether they will return. But every quiet day starts convincing you that perhaps they will not. I think that is what happened to us. We started to believe he had left. Maybe he had moved on. Maybe he was hiding somewhere. Maybe he was too occupied with drugs or whatever else he was doing to come back. At 5 or 6, I could not understand any of those possibilities. I just knew he was not in the house. And when he was not there, the house felt safer. The problem was that he still had a key. That was something I did not understand the importance of until later. To a child, a locked door feels absolute. If the door is locked, bad people stay outside. But a lock does nothing when the person you are afraid of can open it. About 2 weeks after he disappeared, he came back. There was no warning, no long conversation before he entered. He simply had access to the house. And when he came in, he was already screaming. I remember the sound of his voice before almost anything else. It was not normal anger. He sounded completely out of control. He had a gun. He also had a hunting knife on him. Even at 5 or 6, I understood what those objects meant. You do not need to be old enough to understand firearms in detail to understand that a gun can kill somebody. You do not need to know anything about knives to recognize that a large hunting knife is dangerous. And my father was carrying both. He was also extremely intoxicated. I cannot say exactly what he had taken that night. I later understood that methamphetamine and pills were part of his drug use, but as a child, I obviously could not identify substances by looking at him. What I remember is his face, his eyes, his behavior. Something about him looked completely wrong. He was not acting like a person who could be reasoned with. He was agitated, wild, unpredictable. There was a look in his eyes that made me believe, even at that age, that he could kill us. That is not something a 5-year-old should ever have to recognize in a parent. But I did. He started screaming that he had never done anything wrong. That was one of the strangest parts. He was inside the house, armed. My mother was terrified. I was terrified. And he was shouting as though he were the victim, as though everyone else had betrayed him, as though the things he had done somehow did not count. Then he attacked my mother. I was there. I watched it happen. She was crying, trying to protect herself, trying to calm him down, trying to keep him from hurting me. At some point, her focus became not only surviving herself, but begging him not to hurt her child. That is something I still think about. She was the one being attacked, and she was still worried about me. I was small enough that there was almost nothing I could physically do. That helplessness is one of the clearest feelings I remember. Adults are supposed to be huge when you are 5. Your father is especially huge, strong, almost impossible to fight. I watched my mother trying to survive while this armed, drugged, enraged man stood over our entire world. I froze. People sometimes imagine that in a crisis they would immediately become brave. They would run, fight, call the police, grab a weapon, do something heroic. But when you are a small child and you suddenly believe your parent is about to kill your other parent, sometimes your body does nothing. Mine did not know what to do. I remember being terrified that I was about to watch my mother die. That thought was probably not as verbal in my head as it is now. At 5, I may not have thought, My father is about to commit murder. It was simpler. Mom is going to die. Then I might die too. He eventually fired the gun. My mother was hit in the leg. I remember the noise being enormous. Gunshots indoors are not like they sound in movies. There is no distance from them. No soundtrack, no preparation, just an explosion inside a place that is supposed to be your home. The neighbors heard it. At the time, we did not know that, but those shots were probably one of the reasons help eventually came. After the gunfire, my father still did not stop. He had the knife, and from what I remember, it looked like he was preparing to use it against my mother. That was when something changed in me. I was still terrified. I was still only a little kid, but I did not want my mother to die. I started looking for anything I could use. There was no real weapon available to me. I was 5 or 6. I had toys. So I grabbed whatever I could. I remember thinking I had to help somehow. That is one of the saddest parts to remember now. A child standing in a room with an armed adult, trying to figure out how toys could become weapons. There was no realistic way I could overpower him. But children do not calculate strength and odds the way adults do. I only knew my mother needed help. So I tried. Whatever I did was not enough to stop him. He turned toward me. Then he came at me. I remember how fast everything happened after that. One moment, I was focused on my mother. The next, I was the one in danger. He attacked me with the knife. I was stabbed twice in the stomach. I do not remember every physical detail clearly, and I am glad I do not. Some memories from that night are incredibly sharp. Others are fragments. Noise, movement, fear, my mother screaming, my father's face, the weapon, the sense that the room had become chaos. I remember being hurt. I remember realizing that he had actually attacked me too. There is something especially difficult about understanding, even years later, that your own father could look at you as a small child and still continue. Whatever drugs he had taken, whatever anger he felt, whatever he believed about my mother, I was still his child. But in that moment, none of that protected me. What saved me was my mother. Seeing him attack me changed something in her. She had already been hurt. She had already been shot. She had already been fighting for herself. But when he turned on her child, she fought back with everything she had left. I do not remember every movement. I just remember that she managed to get control of the situation enough to stop him from continuing to attack me. There is a kind of instinct people talk about when a parent sees their child in danger. I saw it that night. She was injured, terrified, probably exhausted. And somehow, she still managed to fight. That gave us the time we needed. The neighbors had heard the gunshots. They called the police. A few minutes after I was attacked, officers arrived. I cannot describe the relief of knowing other adults were finally there. People who were not part of the argument. People who were armed and trained. People who could actually stop him. Until that point, the entire world had felt reduced to one house and one violent man controlling everything inside it. Then, suddenly, there were sirens, police, other voices. The outside world had finally reached us. That is where my memory becomes less clear. I know there would have been medical treatment. Questions, police, hospitals, adults talking around me. But what stays strongest is what happened before they arrived. The helpless waiting. The fear that nobody knew what was happening. The belief that my mother and I might both die before anyone came. We survived. That sentence sounds simple. It was not. My mother survived being attacked and shot. I survived being stabbed. The injuries left scars, physical ones, and obviously there are memories too. When I tell the story, a lot of people do not believe me at first. I understand why. It sounds extreme. A violent father disappears, returns 2 weeks later with a gun and hunting knife, attacks his family, shoots the mother, stabs his own young child. Police arrive because neighbors hear the gunshots. It sounds like something from a crime movie. People sometimes assume that stories this extreme must have been exaggerated. Then I show them the scars. I wish I did not have to. The scars should not be necessary for someone to accept that terrible things sometimes really happen inside families. But I understand why people struggle with it. Most people want to believe there is a limit. A parent might yell. A parent might have substance problems. A parent might be violent toward another adult. But surely there is some final line they would never cross with their own little child. My father crossed it. For a long time, I think the most difficult part was trying to understand why. As a child, you naturally assume adults know what they are doing, even when they are frightening. You think there must be some explanation you are too young to understand. Maybe you did something. Maybe your mother did something. Maybe the adult is angry for some reason that makes sense to grown-ups. But nothing makes that night reasonable. My mother wanting to leave did not justify violence. His drug use did not make us responsible for his choices. His criminal history did not make what happened inevitable. His belief that he had never done anything wrong did not make it true. He was responsible for walking into that house armed. He was responsible for attacking us. I understand that much more clearly as an adult than I could as a child. At 5 or 6, though, I was not thinking about responsibility. I was thinking about survival. Children are very good at adapting to frightening environments because they have no choice. You learn people's footsteps. You learn voices. You learn when an argument is becoming dangerous. You learn which room feels safest. You notice whether someone has been drinking or using drugs, even if you do not understand what drugs are. You notice eyes, tone, movement. You become sensitive to tiny changes because those changes matter. That may be why I remember my father's eyes so clearly. Something in his face told me before the worst part happened that he was not himself in any safe or predictable sense. I knew we were in danger. There is no supernatural element to this story. No ghost, no creature, no unexplained noise. Everything frightening about it was human. That is part of why it has stayed with me so strongly. There is no comforting way to dismiss it. I cannot say I dreamed it. I cannot say it was a shadow in a dark room. I cannot explain it as a strange animal or an optical illusion. It happened. There were injuries. Police, neighbors, scars. My mother and I lived through something that could easily have ended differently. Sometimes I think about how much depended on small pieces of timing. The neighbors had to hear the shots. They had to recognize something was wrong. Someone had to call police. The officers had to arrive when they did. My mother had to find enough strength to fight after being injured. If any one of those things had changed, I do not know what would have happened. That is probably the thought that still scares me most. Not what happened. What almost happened. I remember believing I was about to watch my father kill my mother. Then I remember realizing I might be next. That kind of fear does not fit easily into childhood. At 5 or 6, your biggest fears should be things under the bed. Dark hallways. Getting lost in a shop. Maybe a scary movie. You should not know what it feels like to look at a parent holding a weapon and wonder whether that parent intends to kill you. But I did. I also remember the confusion of still thinking of him as my father while being terrified of him. That is difficult to explain to people who have never experienced violence from a parent. The relationship does not disappear the second they hurt someone. The word dad is still attached. Your childhood memories are still attached. Whatever good moments existed are still somewhere in your mind, and now they are sitting beside something impossible. The person who was supposed to protect you became the person everyone else needed to protect you from. Years later, people sometimes focus on the most dramatic parts. The gun, the knife, the scars. Those are obviously important. But the detail that stays with me most is much smaller. I was 5 or 6 years old, watching my mother being hurt, and I started looking around for something I could use to save her. And what I found were toys. That was what my world contained. Toys. I was still a child. I should have been playing with them. Instead, I was trying to turn them into something that could stop an armed adult. I knew they would probably do almost nothing. But doing nothing felt worse. That says everything about how desperate the situation was. I do not think what I did was heroic in some movie sense. I was terrified. I froze first. I did not know what I was doing. I was a kid trying to keep my mother alive. And when my father turned on me, my mother did exactly the same thing. She fought to keep me alive. That is how I remember us. Not as victims frozen forever in that house. As two people trying desperately to protect each other, while someone much stronger and heavily armed was trying to destroy everything around him. We got out alive. That matters. The story still affects me. Obviously, there are physical reminders. The scars are there. They do not let the event become completely distant. I can look at them and know that whatever pieces of the memory have blurred with time, the core of it was real. Memory from 5 or 6 years old is imperfect. I know that. I cannot promise every sentence someone screamed was exactly as I remember it. I cannot reconstruct every movement in order. Traumatic events can be remembered in fragments, and I was extremely young, so I try to be careful about the details I cannot verify, but I do not doubt the event itself. My father returned. He was armed. He attacked my mother. He shot her. He attacked me. My mother fought him. The neighbors called police after hearing gunfire. We survived. Those facts are not something I need imagination to create. People sometimes ask why someone would go back to a house after 2 weeks if they knew the relationship was over. I do not know what was going on in his mind. Maybe drugs, possessiveness, anger, a belief that my mother had no right to leave. Maybe all of those things together. But I do not think understanding his exact thought process would make the story easier. There is no explanation that would turn what happened into something reasonable. Sometimes, trying too hard to understand a violent person's motive can accidentally shift attention away from the people who had to survive them. I know enough. My mother tried to leave. He responded with violence. Then, he came back armed. Everything after that was the consequence of his choices. I also think about the neighbors. They may never have known exactly how important that phone call was. To them, maybe it was simple. They heard gunshots. They called emergency services. That is what you are supposed to do. But inside our house, those few minutes mattered enormously. A lot of violence happens behind closed doors because outsiders hear something and decide it is not their business. Maybe an argument. Maybe a television. Maybe fireworks. Maybe someone else will call. Our neighbors did not ignore it. They heard something serious and acted. I am grateful for that. By the time police arrived, my mother had already managed to stop the attack from continuing. But we needed help immediately. Medical help. Police protection. Adults who could take control. Their call brought that. I sometimes wonder what the officers thought when they walked inside. They would have seen the aftermath of something that probably looked unbelievable. A mother injured, a small child injured, an armed father, a family home turned into a crime scene. For me, it was my entire world. For them, it may have been one terrible call among many. That is another strange thing you realize later. The worst night of your life can be someone else's shift at work. Doctors treat you. Police write reports. Paramedics move quickly. Then they go on to the next emergency. You carry it for decades. I do not say that bitterly. Their ability to treat it as a job is part of what allows them to function when everyone else is falling apart. But it explains why survivors can feel like they exist in a different timeline from everyone around them. People move on. The scars stay. I think that is why disbelief bothers me. Not because I expect strangers to accept every story without question. People lie online. Stories get exaggerated. I understand skepticism. But there is something strange about describing a memory you wish had never happened and seeing someone react as though it is too extreme to be real. Sometimes reality is extreme. Sometimes children really do grow up in houses where an armed parent comes through the door. Sometimes the person everyone expects to protect the family is the threat. Sometimes the child survives and grows up with scars people ask to see before they believe them. I would rather have a boring childhood story nobody finds interesting. I would rather the scars not exist. I would rather my memory from that age be about school, cartoons, toys, or some stupid childhood argument. Instead, one of the clearest things I remember from being 5 or 6 is believing my mother was about to die. Then believing I would too. We did not. That is the part I try to hold on to. My mother survived. I survived. The neighbors acted. Police came. The attack ended. Nothing changes what he did. But he did not get the ending he seemed prepared to create that night. For years, when I thought about it, the memory always began with him coming through the door. Now I think the more important image comes later. My mother was injured and terrified, but when he turned toward me, she still found a way to fight. She could have been completely overwhelmed. Instead, she protected her child. And before that, in the limited way a tiny child could, I had tried to protect her too. That does not make the story less frightening, but it changes what I see when I remember it. I do not only see him, I see us surviving him. Still, there are nights when the original fear comes back unexpectedly. A loud argument somewhere, a sudden bang, a certain look in someone's eyes when they are intoxicated. Something small can bring back the feeling of that house. The locked door that was not really protection because he still had the key. The moment he came in screaming. The weapons, my mother's voice. The realization that nobody else was in the room to stop him. Then, eventually, the sound of help arriving from outside. People sometimes ask whether the worst part was being attacked myself. It was horrible. But the moment that stays deepest is before that. Watching my mother. Being too small to help. Thinking I was going to watch her die. That helplessness was worse than anything I knew how to describe at 5 years old. Maybe that is why I moved at all. Not because I stopped being scared, because fear of losing her became stronger than fear of him. I grabbed toys because toys were all I had. It sounds almost absurd when written down. A gun, a hunting knife, and a little kid with toys. There was never a fair fight there. There was only desperation. But sometimes survival is built out of desperate seconds. A child tries something. A mother fights back. A neighbor makes a phone call. Police arrive. And somehow, 2 people who might not have survived the night are still alive years later to remember it. I know some people will read the story and think it sounds unbelievable. That is okay. I cannot make anyone believe something they were not there to see. I do not enjoy proving it. But the scars are still there. They are the simplest evidence I have that the night was not some distorted childhood nightmare. I was 5 or 6. My mother was trying to leave a violent man. For 2 weeks, we thought he had disappeared from our lives. Then one night, he used the key he still had, came through our door armed and intoxicated, and turned our home into the most frightening place I had ever known. We survived because my mother fought for me, and because people outside those walls heard something was wrong and called for help. That is the part strangers sometimes have difficulty believing. For me, the difficult part has always been the opposite. I was there. I know it happened. And even after all these years, the thing I still struggle to understand is how the person I was supposed to call Dad could look at his own terrified 5-year-old child and keep coming toward me anyway. About 2 years ago, I was camping with my family in Namibia, and during that trip I had 2 nighttime experiences involving animals that could not have felt more different. The first one genuinely terrified me. The second one scared all of us for a few seconds, and then became almost funny. We were traveling through Namibia and stopped for our first night at an abandoned campsite near a dry riverbed. The campsite was high up on a kopje, which is basically a rocky formation too small to really call a mountain, but much bigger and rougher than an ordinary hill. The whole area was surrounded by rock. It was beautiful during the day. At night, it felt much more isolated. There were no normal campsite noises, no neighboring families, no generators running nearby, no people walking around with flashlights. It was just us, the rocks, the riverbed below, and whatever animals were moving through the area after dark. The campsite being abandoned added to the atmosphere, although nothing unusual had happened when we arrived. We set up our tents around the rocky terrain. Because of the way the kopje was shaped, the tents were not all directly beside one another. Large pieces of rock and natural formation separated some of us. You could still call out if you needed someone, but when you were inside your own tent, you could not necessarily see the others. That did not bother me at first. We spent the evening around the fire. We made toasted cheese sandwiches. We talked. We watched the stars. Namibia at night can feel enormous because once you get away from populated areas, there is so little artificial light. The sky seemed endless. It was one of those camping evenings where everything felt calm enough that you almost forgot how far away you were from normal houses, streets, and locked doors. Eventually, everyone started getting ready for bed. We separated and went to our tents. I climbed into mine and zipped it shut. I was not trying to fall asleep immediately. I still had my phone, so I started playing Geometry Dash for a while before bed. That is probably why the first sound caught my attention so sharply. I was completely focused on the screen. Then, I heard rocks move outside. A small slide. Something shifted on the rocky ground. Then, a stone came down and hit the side of my tent. I stopped playing. At first, I did not panic. There were plenty of reasons rocks could move on a kopje. Loose stones settle. Small animals move through them. Wind can disturb things. Maybe someone from my family had walked nearby. I looked through the mesh section of the tent. Nothing. From inside, I could only see a limited area. Beyond that was darkness. I listened for a little while. Nothing obvious happened. So eventually I went back to my phone. A few minutes later, I heard something else. Sniffing, that sound was completely different from a rock moving. It sounded close. Very close. Something was right outside my tent. I stopped moving. I listened. There it was again. An animal sniffing around the fabric. My immediate thought was that some wild animal had come to investigate us. That alone was enough to make me nervous. We were camping in Namibia. This was not a backyard. There were animals in the area that you absolutely did not want walking around your tent in the middle of the night. I slowly looked through the mesh again, and that was when I saw it. A leopard. It was circling my tent. Even now, I remember the shock of realizing how close it was. This was not an animal somewhere across the riverbed. It was not a pair of eyes on a distant ridge. It was right there, moving around the outside of the tent. Sniffing, investigating, the thin material between us suddenly felt completely useless. A tent gives you psychological comfort when camping because it feels like a little room. You zip it closed. Your sleeping bag is inside. Your belongings are around you. For a few hours, you almost forget that the walls are just fabric. Seeing a leopard outside instantly removes that illusion. There is no real barrier. If an animal that powerful decided it wanted inside, the tent itself would not stop it. I went completely silent. I did not call out to my family. I did not reach for the zipper. I did not want to make any sudden noise or movement that might increase its interest. I even found myself holding my breath. I know realistically a leopard could probably already smell me perfectly well through the tent. Holding my breath was not going to make me disappear. But fear does not always produce logical behavior. My instinct was simply, do not move. Do not make noise. Do not give it another reason to focus on you. So I lay there. I watched when I could. Listened when I could not see it. The animal continued circling. It seemed to be sniffing the tent and the area around it. I could not tell exactly what it wanted. Maybe it was curious. Maybe it smelled food. Maybe it smelled me. Maybe it was simply passing through the campsite and investigating this strange new object sitting on its territory. At the time, none of those explanations made me feel better. I was convinced it had taken some kind of interest in me personally. Every time I heard movement around the tent, I imagined it deciding whether to come closer. I did not know what I was supposed to do. Calling out might scare it away, or maybe shouting would startle it. Getting out of the tent was obviously not something I wanted to try, so I stayed where I was. Eventually, the leopard moved away. From what I could tell, it went down the kopje. The sounds faded. I could no longer see it, but that did not mean I immediately relaxed. Once you have seen a leopard walking around your tent at night, silence is no longer reassuring. Silence just means you do not know where the leopard is. For all I knew, it had stopped somewhere outside my field of view. Maybe it was watching. Maybe it had gone toward another tent. Maybe it was sitting 20 feet away. I had no way to know. I barely slept. Every little movement outside became suspicious. A small rock shifting. Wind. An insect. Anything. My brain immediately returned to the leopard. Is it back? I stayed inside the tent until morning. Even after the sun came up, I still did not feel safe enough to immediately unzip the door and step outside. That sounds ridiculous in daylight, but I had spent the entire night building the animal into something that could still be waiting nearby. The morning light did not instantly erase that fear. I looked through the mesh, waited, listened. I knew my family would eventually be moving around, but I still hesitated. It took me nearly 2 hours to finally build up enough courage to leave the tent. Once I did, I told everyone what had happened. I explained the rock, the sniffing, looking out, seeing the leopard, watching it circle my tent, then seeing it move away down the kopje. I expected them to react more strongly. Instead, I got the feeling some of them were not completely convinced. That was frustrating because the experience had felt so clear to me. I had not just heard an animal. I believed I had actually seen it. But there was a problem. We had a camera set up near the vehicle. We would place it each night in the hope of capturing wildlife. It was pointed towards some meat we had left out specifically to attract animals into view. Naturally, after I told everyone about the leopard, we checked the camera. Nothing, no leopard. No clear footage showing a big cat moving through the campsite. That made my story much harder to prove. We also looked around for tracks. But the campsite was on rocky ground. There was not much soft sand or mud where an animal would leave beautiful, obvious footprints. We found maybe one or two marks that could have been tracks, but my family thought they looked old. There was nothing like a clean line of fresh leopard prints circling my tent. So from their perspective, there was no physical evidence, no camera footage, no clear, fresh tracks. Only my story. I think that is why some of them did not really believe me. But the lack of camera footage does not necessarily mean an animal was not there. The camera was pointed toward the meat. My tent was not necessarily directly in its field of view. If the leopard came from another direction, circled my tent, then moved back down the rocks without approaching the bait, the camera could easily miss it. Wild animals do not have any obligation to walk through the exact section you are recording. The meat might not have interested it. Maybe it had already eaten. Maybe it noticed human scent and avoided the bait. Maybe the camera angle simply did not cover the path it took. The absence of footage only tells us the camera did not record a leopard where it was pointing. It does not prove there was no leopard elsewhere. The rocky terrain makes the track problem similar. People imagine large animals always leave obvious footprints, but tracks depend heavily on the ground. Soft mud, great, wet sand, easy, loose dust, possible solid rock and stones, not so much. An animal can cross hard ground and leave almost nothing a normal person would recognize. Even if those one or two prints were fresh, we had no way to date them precisely. Maybe they were old, maybe they were from the night before. Without an experienced tracker examining them, we were guessing. So the lack of tracks never convinced me that I had imagined the whole thing. At the same time, I understand why my family was skeptical. It was dark. I was alone. I had been lying in a tent playing on my phone. The first thing I heard was rocks moving, then sniffing. I looked through mesh under poor lighting. Could I have misidentified another animal as a leopard? It is possible. Night vision is unreliable. Tent mesh can distort details. If you are looking through a small opening, you only see part of an animal at a time. Maybe it was a smaller wildcat. Maybe another animal with a similar body shape. Maybe something moved close enough that my brain filled in the details. I do not think that is what happened, because the image in my memory is very specific. But I have to admit, the conditions were not ideal for identification. I was frightened. Fear makes the brain classify things quickly. In Namibia, if you see a spotted or cat-shaped animal at night and immediately think leopard, every movement afterward gets interpreted through that label. Once you have decided a dangerous predator is outside, the body does not care about careful zoological identification. It just wants you to survive. There is also the possibility that the leopard was genuinely there, but was much less interested in me than I believed. That is probably what I think now. At the time, it is hunting me. It knows I am here. It wants something from me. Now, it may have been curious about a strange fabric structure in its environment. Animals investigate scents. Humans had recently set up camp. We cooked food. There was meat elsewhere around the campsite. We had been walking everywhere. The area would have been full of unfamiliar smells. My tent may simply have been one thing the animal checked before moving on. The fact that it eventually left without doing anything supports that. It did not attack the tent, did not paw at it, did not try to get inside. It sniffed, circled, left. That sounds more like investigation than active aggression. But when you are alone behind a layer of tent fabric, that distinction does not matter emotionally. A curious leopard is still a leopard. Another thing that bothered me afterward was the rock hitting the tent. At the time, I connected that directly to the animal. Something moved on the rocky slope. A stone slid down, hit the tent. Then, minutes later, I heard sniffing. That sequence makes sense if the leopard was already moving nearby. Its weight could disturb loose rock. The stone rolls. I look. Nothing visible. The leopard continues moving, eventually comes close enough for me to hear it sniff. That is probably what happened. But the rock may also have been unrelated. Rocky terrain shifts. An animal much smaller than a leopard could move a loose stone. Wind, temperature changes. Anything, then later another animal appeared. The two events become one story because they happened close together. Again, timing makes things look connected even when they may not be. What I am much more confident about is the sniffing. Something living was close. A repeated sniff near the tent is difficult to confuse with a rock settling. And once I looked out, I saw a large cat-like animal moving around. Whatever the exact species or size, I do not think the entire experience came from nothing. There was an animal. The uncertainty is what kind and how interested it actually was. I also think my family not immediately believing me made the memory stronger. If the camera had captured a perfect image of a leopard beside my tent, the story would be settled. Everyone would say, "There it is. You were right." Then we would talk about how dangerous or lucky the encounter was. Instead, the camera showed nothing. Now I had experienced something terrifying that only I could confirm. That makes you replay the memory. Was it really a leopard? Did I see it clearly? Could something else produce the same shape? You end up defending the experience to yourself because nobody else can verify it. But even if I was wrong about some visual detail, the fear was not imaginary. Something was outside the tent. I heard it. I saw movement. I spent the night believing a predator was feet away. That experience was real, even if the exact animal remains uncertain. The trip gave us another big cat scare later, except that one ended very differently. For our last night, we decided to do something much more comfortable. We went to the White Lady Elephant Lodge. Compared with the abandoned campsite, this felt almost luxurious. We were still sleeping in tents, but there was a pool. After days of more basic camping, having access to something like that felt glamorous. When we arrived, a woman at reception gave us a warning. She told us not to wander too far away from our tents at night because lions had recently been sighted in the area. That warning immediately stayed in everyone's mind. You do not hear lions have been seen nearby and then forget it 10 minutes later. It changes the way you look into the darkness. Later that night, we were around the campfire. We had headlamps. At some point, we started playing around with the lights, shining them into nearby bushes and across the darkness. Then our beams hit a bush. 2 pairs of eyes reflected back. 4 bright points. Cat eyes. Everyone froze. For a second, the warning from reception became the only thought any of us had. Lions, there are lions around here. And now there are 2 pairs of feline eyes looking at us from a bush. The entire group got nervous. It is amazing how little information you need for fear to create the rest. We could not see bodies clearly at first, just eyes. But the brain already knew what it expected. Lion sightings, dark bush, 2 sets of eyes, therefore lions. Then the animals stepped forward, and our terrifying lions turned into 2 stray cats. Normal little cats. We all breathed again. The difference between the fear and the reality was almost ridiculous. Only seconds earlier, those eyes belonged to large predators in our minds. Then, the owners of the eyes walked into better light, and the threat disappeared completely. We ended up spending the rest of the night trying to gain their trust. We gave them leftovers, poured out some water. They seemed to live around the campsite, or at least spend enough time there to know humans meant food. What had started as "there are two lions watching us" turned into "let's make friends with the cats." That experience made me think about the leopard night differently afterward. Because at the lodge, every person there made the same mistake for a few seconds. We had been warned about lions. We saw cat eyes. Our brains immediately created lions. The external stimulus was real. There genuinely were animals in the bushes. But our first identification was wrong, because expectation filled in what darkness hid. That is exactly the kind of thing that could have happened to me at the abandoned campsite. Maybe there was a real animal outside my tent. Maybe I genuinely saw a cat-shaped body. But because I knew where we were and knew what animals might exist there, my brain upgraded uncertainty into a leopard. The second experience proved how easy that is. At the same time, the two situations were not identical. At the lodge, once the cats stepped into better light, everyone immediately saw what they were. At the first campsite, I never got that second look. I saw the animal only under bad conditions. Then it disappeared down the rocks. So my first interpretation never had a chance to be corrected. That leaves the leopard identification open. Maybe I was completely right. Maybe not. If I had turned on a strong light and the animal had stepped clearly into view, the question would be gone. But using a bright light on an unknown predator outside your tent at night is not exactly the kind of experiment I wanted to try. I was more interested in staying unnoticed. So the encounter remains unresolved in a way the stray cat scare does not. The second story also shows how warnings shape perception. The woman at the lodge said, "There have been lions." After that, every pair of reflective eyes had the potential to become a lion. At the abandoned campsite, we were already in an environment where large wildlife was possible. I knew that. Then I heard something substantial enough to disturb rocks. Something sniffed the tent. My mind had all the ingredients it needed to produce the most dangerous, reasonable animal. That does not mean the leopard was imaginary. It means context mattered. Animals can also look much larger at night than they are. Without clear reference points, a medium-sized cat close to the tent could seem bigger. Tent mesh reduces detail. Moonlight and darkness hide scale. If only parts of the animal are visible at once, the brain constructs the rest. So perhaps I saw a smaller cat species or some other animal and interpreted the outline as leopard-sized. Again, possible, but I remember the body as unmistakably large enough to frighten me. I cannot reduce the memory beyond that. One thing I definitely learned on the trip was that eye shine is incredibly deceptive. Those two stray cats taught us that. In darkness, a pair of shining eyes seems to float without scale. They could belong to a house cat 5 meters away or a much larger animal farther back. You need body shape, movement, height, spacing, and context before you can identify anything. We had almost none of that when we first saw them. So naturally, we selected the animal we had been warned about. Fear is fast. Identification is slower. That is probably a useful way of understanding both events. At the first campsite, fear made a decision before careful identification was possible. At the second, we got enough extra information to correct it. The other major difference was numbers. At the abandoned campsite, I was alone inside my tent. Everyone else was separated by rock formations. There was nobody beside me saying, "I see it too." That makes fear much stronger. At the lodge, we were all around the fire together. Even when we thought the eyes belonged to lions, we were a group. We had light. We had other people. The lodge itself was occupied. There was staff nearby. That gave the second event a safety net. The first one had none. Inside that tent, I felt completely isolated. I could have called my family, but I did not know what doing that would cause. Maybe someone would unzip their tent and walk directly toward the animal. That thought alone may have kept me quiet. If I shouted leopard, what would everyone do? Turn on lights? Come outside? Panic? I had no idea. So silence seemed safer. Whether that was actually the best wildlife response is not something I can judge confidently from a frightened memory. I only know what I chose. Stay still. Stay quiet. Wait, eventually, it worked in the sense that the animal left. The 2-hour delay the next morning sounds excessive now, but I understand it. The night had trained me to think outside tent equals leopard. Sunrise does not instantly erase that association. I needed to hear normal family activity, see people walking around, see that nothing was waiting nearby. Only then could I force myself to open the zipper. That is how strong fear can be after a close animal encounter. The danger may already be gone. Your body does not know that. It keeps behaving as if the last confirmed information is still true. Last confirmed information, large predator outside. Therefore, stay inside. The camera was supposed to give objective evidence, but because it captured nothing, the psychological uncertainty survived. I sometimes imagine how different the story would feel if there were one photograph. A leopard passing behind my tent. No doubt. Or alternatively, a jackal or smaller cat. Mystery solved in the other direction. Instead, nothing. That blank camera became almost as memorable as the sighting. It did not prove me wrong, but it denied me proof that I was right. I think that is why the family's disbelief bothered me. I had been terrified for hours. Then morning came and everyone else could continue the trip normally. For them, no footage, no fresh tracks, probably not a leopard. For me, I watched it walk around my tent. Those are completely different positions. Neither side had enough evidence to settle it. I cannot blame them for wanting something physical. I also cannot make myself believe I invented the whole experience. The safest conclusion is probably somewhere in between. A real animal came close to my tent. I had a brief nighttime view through mesh. I identified it as a leopard. That identification may have been correct, especially in a place where such wildlife is possible. But because there was no independent confirmation, I cannot prove it. That does not reduce the story. If anything, it makes it more honest. What I remember is not, I definitely proved a leopard stalked me. What I remember is, I was alone in a tent on a rocky campsite in Namibia, heard something outside, looked through the mesh, and saw what I believed was a leopard slowly circling and sniffing around me. That is scary enough. There is no need to exaggerate it into an attack. The animal never tried to get inside. It never lunged. It never growled at me. It simply investigated and eventually left. The fear came from what it could have done, not what it actually did. That is often worse. Possibility gives imagination unlimited room. A leopard actually attacking creates a specific emergency. A leopard quietly sniffing the tent leaves you wondering what it is deciding. Is it curious? Hungry? Does it know exactly what is inside? Will it leave? Every second becomes anticipation. That was the terror. The later stray cats were the opposite. The fear existed only until we got more information. Eyes, possible lions. Cats walk out. Fear collapses. Then, we fed them. I like that those two experiences happened during the same trip because they almost balance each other. One taught me how real wildlife danger can feel when there is no barrier between you and the darkness. The other taught me how easily darkness can turn harmless animals into exactly the predators you are expecting. Maybe that second lesson should make me question the leopard more. It does, but it does not erase the first experience. I still remember the sniffing, still remember looking out, still remember the shape moving around the tent, still remember holding my breath as if that could somehow hide me. And I remember waiting for the morning while every tiny rock sound made me think it had returned. Maybe the camera simply missed it. Maybe those one or two prints were actually fresh. Maybe my family dismissed them because they had no reason to believe my story yet. Or maybe the animal was something else, and my frightened brain gave it the most dangerous identity available. I will probably never know. The campsite was temporary. We moved on. The rocks kept no clear record. No one else saw what I saw. That is enough uncertainty to keep the memory alive. But whenever I think about that trip, I also remember the final night. The warning about lions. The headlamps swinging toward a bush. Two pairs of eyes reflecting back. Everyone suddenly going quiet. Then, two little stray cats casually walking into the light while an entire group of people realized they had just mentally turned house cats into lions. We laughed, fed them leftovers, gave them water, spent the evening trying to get them comfortable around us. That was the harmless version of the same basic fear. Something is in the dark. You cannot see enough. Your brain supplies the rest. Maybe the first night was like that too. Maybe not. The difference is that on the first night, whatever was sniffing around my tent never stepped into good enough light to give me a second answer. So in my memory, it is still the same animal I believed it was when I first looked through the mesh. A leopard, moving slowly around a thin tent on an abandoned kopje while my entire family slept behind separate walls of rock. And even if someone could prove to me now that it had only been some smaller animal, I do not think that would erase the feeling of lying absolutely still in the dark, hearing it breathe and sniff only a layer of fabric away, and realizing how little protection a zipped tent really gives you when something wild decides to come close.
The broadcast is ending, but some voices do not disappear when the radio goes quiet. Maybe one of tonight's confessions will stay with you. Maybe you will remember it the next time your phone rings at an odd hour, or when you hear something outside after midnight. Leave a comment with the story that got under your skin the most. Subscribe to Dead Air Confessions for more stories from the people who called in after something went wrong.